Beneath the oldest oak in St. Mary Mead lies a secret buried so deep it took death to bring it back to the surface. A maid is found dead, a vicar disappears, and Miss Marple begins to unravel a pattern that stretches back generations. But what if this time she's too late? Before we descend into the mystery, consider hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you won't miss our daily mysteries. It's the best way to stay with us through every chapter and every chilling revelation. Miss Marple and the Murder Beneath the Oak Tree, a chilling mystery inspired by Agatha Christie, Chapter 1. The village sleeps. St. Mary Mead. That gentle patch of English countryside where rose gardens meet gossip over tea, and the ordinary folds over itself like a neatly pressed handkerchief, each corner tucked away, hiding just a hint of something unspoken. In the early morning hours, the village breathes in a kind of silence that only exists in places forgotten by time. Birdsong flutters at a respectful distance, leaves rustle not with wind, but memory, and even the chiming of the church bell feels as though it's remembering rather than announcing. It was in that stillness, in that peculiar calm, that Miss Jane Marple sat at her window, the lace curtains parted by her careful hand, the edge of her thumb just brushing the porcelain rim of her teacup. The oak tree stood in the far distance, partially obscured, yet somehow always present. Some said it had been there since the Druids, others claimed its roots twisted through unmarked graves from the village's darker chapters, but Miss Marple, in her measured wisdom, never indulged in such folklore, though she never dismissed it either. For beneath that tree, long before the fete was even whispered about, something had begun, not loudly, nor with violence, but with a quiet that felt too deep, too still, a quiet that was waiting to be noticed. That summer had arrived with an unusual dryness. The air, though sweet with honeysuckle, carried a dryness that cracked the soil and peeled paint from even the most stubborn shutters. It made tempers short and secrets brittle, and in this brittle heat arrived 4 figures who, though not new to the village, were now brought together under circumstances that none yet understood. First, the vicar, Reverend Hale, a gentle man of soft convictions and even softer sermons. He had a way of quoting scripture with a voice so musical, it lulled his listeners into reflection rather than resolve. But lately, the Reverend had been troubled, not in word, but in rhythm. His morning walks had grown longer, and his eyes, once attentive, now flitted toward the oak more often than the heavens. Then there was Arthur, new to the gardening post at the rectory, broad-shouldered, quiet, efficient. A man whose past was no more than a single sheet in the parish record, and even that smudged with water damage. He tended the grounds with dutiful skill, but never whistled, never greeted the birds that congregated near the hedges as the previous gardener once had. He had a curious habit of working in the shade, even when the sun was low, and once, just once, Miss Marple thought she saw him tracing the bark of the oak tree with his fingertips, as though trying to read it. Third, the journalist, name, Oliver Brent, age 32. Specialization, local folklore and forgotten rituals of the English countryside. His letters of inquiry had arrived weeks before he did, each signed with a flourish and a line of poetry at the bottom, as though he fancied himself a literary archaeologist rather than a writer. He arrived with a camera, a tape recorder, and a stack of books marked Private Archive. What most villagers did not know, what only Miss Marple suspected, was that he had not come to admire the village's architecture, or quote lines about midsummer rites. He had come because of the oak, specifically, the story of a girl who was said to have vanished there in 1875. And finally, of course, there was Miss Marple herself, observant as ever, slightly more fragile now, but no less sharp. The lines in her face had deepened, yes, but they were not cracks, they were notes, etched into the margins of a mind that had studied 1,000 faces and remembered every lie told between cups of tea. She did not believe in coincidences, nor in the innocence of first impressions. And when she saw Arthur, Reverend Hale, and young Mr. Brent, each pause on separate days, by that same tree with an expression not quite explainable, her knitting slowed, and her ears pricked up. The village fete approached as it always did, with bunting strung between chimneys, the scent of clotted cream and sponge cake in the air, and a program of harmless entertainments, maypole dances, dog shows, and apple bobbing. Children practiced their steps, mothers practiced their smiles. Yet the oak tree, just beyond the path where the fete would be held, loomed as it always had. It cast a longer shadow than any tree its height should, and though no one would say it aloud, it was left off the map drawn for the fete's layout. It was Mrs. Tilling, the baker's wife, who first noticed the silence. Not the absence of noise, but something else, the sense that noise itself had retreated. It happened around tea time, just as she brought a tray of lemon curd tarts to the judging tent. She paused, tray in hand, frowning. The laughter had stopped, the wind had stopped. Even the clinking of cutlery had ceased, not for long, only a few seconds, but long enough for her to blink twice and mutter, "Well, that's odd." Miss Marple, sitting nearby with her embroidery, did not speak, but her needle paused. Her eyes, however, did not turn toward the fete. They turned slowly, deliberately, to the oak. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. And so began the summer fete beneath the tree that had stood longer than the village itself, in a year when the ground was too dry, the people too polite, and the air too quiet. Something had returned to St. Mary Mead, but it was not something new. It was something remembered. If you found yourself drawn to these quiet beginnings, and wish to follow the threads that bind every whisper, every glance, and every truth left unsaid, I invite you, most politely, to subscribe, and to turn on your notifications. It is the best way to remain with us through every chapter, and every revelation yet to come, for what lies beneath the roots of this story has only just begun to stir. In any other village, the fete would have been the climax of the summer, a crescendo of cakes, smiles, and gentle rivalry over who baked the lightest scones, or raised the cleverest spaniel. But here, in St. Mary Mead, it always felt more like an obligation, a tradition whose purpose had been forgotten, but whose structure remained unchallenged. Banners went up, tables unfolded, the same faces smiled at the same jokes, and the sun obligingly peeked through a gauze of clouds at just the right hour. And yet, this year, something shifted, not visibly, not even audibly, but like a crease beneath a carpet. It could be felt underfoot by those attuned to such things. Miss Marple, for instance, noticed it in the way the Reverend's sermon the Sunday before had wandered. Not thematically, he had always been prone to weaving metaphors a touch too far, but emotionally, he'd paused halfway through a reading of Ecclesiastes, staring through the open church window, as though he expected to see something outside. The passage, meant to be about the cycles of life, had turned strangely specific. There is a time to sow, he had said, eyes distant, voice softer than usual, and a time to pull from the earth what should not grow. There was no reaction at the time, perhaps a few furrowed brows. But Miss Marple, sitting halfway back on the right-hand pew, had not missed the gardener's posture stiffening just then. Nor had she missed the way Oliver Brent, Mr. Brent, as he introduced himself far too formally to be trusted, had begun scribbling in a leather notebook. Oliver had taken up lodging at the Old Vane Cottage, a charming structure draped in ivy and set at the edge of the village, closer to the woods than most dared live. He claimed the quiet suited his work, but he spoke to everyone, which in Miss Marple's experience was the surest sign a man was listening more than he was speaking. She watched him one afternoon from her window. He'd paused by the bakery, chatting easily with Mrs. Tilling, then proceeded to the green, where he knelt to photograph something no one else had noticed, a line of tiny mushrooms growing toward the fete grounds. Fairy rings, he'd said later to the florist, with a casual smile. Harmless, old folklore, but Miss Marple had seen his face when he said it. Not fear, precisely, but recognition, and perhaps something else. A memory. The fete itself, on the surface, was charming. The air smelled of shortbread and grass. Children wore flower crowns. A retired magistrate judged the sheepdog parade with thinly veiled boredom. Laughter came in polite waves. And yet, somehow, the tree watched. It stood beyond the path, half-shaded, ignored only by agreement. No one sat near it. No bunting was tied to its branches. Its roots stretched into the dry earth like the fingers of something too old to sleep. That was when the silence returned. Not a long one, perhaps 7 seconds. No music, no children's chatter, even the bees seemed to halt mid-air. It passed like a breath held and forgotten, and when it ended, a few people chuckled nervously, unsure why they had stopped moving. Reverend Hale, however, looked directly at the oak tree during that moment, and not with curiosity, but apology. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the fire not yet lit, but her shawl draped about her shoulders. Her tea had gone cold, but she hadn't noticed. Instead, she held in her hand a clipping, yellowed, from a folder she kept in a locked drawer beneath her writing desk. A single paragraph from an 1875 local gazette. During the midsummer celebration, young Annabel Crowthorne vanished between the dance and the crowning of the Flower Queen. Her bonnet was found at the base of the oak tree, no signs of struggle, no footprints. Only the soil, churned and damp, despite a fortnight without rain. The name hadn't been mentioned in years, perhaps not since Miss Marple herself had been a girl, still plaiting her hair and too young to understand what vanished truly meant. But the name had returned, in the most peculiar way, etched into the bark of the oak, newly scratched, with a penknife, or perhaps something duller. Oliver Brent had passed it off as part of the folklore, an old carving, he'd suggested. But Miss Marple had touched it with her gloved hand. The edges were fresh, and someone had gone to some trouble to mask it with moss. The fete ended, without incident, or so it was said, but when the children were counted for the final maypole dance, one was missing, only briefly, and she was found moments later, crying behind the judging tent, unsure of how she had gotten there. She claimed to have been looking at the tree, that it had moved, that it had whispered. Children's stories, of course, easily dismissed. Unless you were Miss Marple, because she remembered, with discomfort, that the maid who'd vanished in 1875 had also been a child once, and she too had been found crying behind the judging tent. Only that time, it was the year before she vanished, and she too had said the tree whispered. It would be weeks before anyone disappeared, months even before questions would be asked aloud. But in that first moment, at the fete, during the pause in sound, something shifted. Something turned its face toward the village, and decided it was time again, and Miss Marple, knitting forgotten on her lap, said aloud to no one at all, "It's starting." That same night, the sky did not darken with the usual grace of twilight, rather it seemed to settle with a kind of heaviness, as though the light itself had grown tired of watching. The sun sank lower, yes, but its rays did not stretch, they pulled instead, stuck between the hedgerows, caught beneath the branches, clinging to surfaces, as if reluctant to let go. And under this reluctant dusk, St. Mary Mead carried on with its ordinary rituals, the rustling of evening papers, the clatter of dishware from supper being cleared, the familiar click of window latches drawn against the breeze. Oliver Brent, however, was not inside. He stood near the oak, his camera hanging limp from his shoulder, though he made no motion to lift it. He stared up at the bark, touched it once with his hand, just long enough to feel the texture, to note the coolness beneath his fingers despite the warm air, and then stepped back. The notebook in his breast pocket fluttered slightly as the wind picked up, but he did not reach to steady it. His eyes were scanning, left, right, then downward toward the base of the tree, where a small hollow could be seen. It was barely more than a dent, but there was something inside it, something he did not touch. A glint, metal, no, perhaps glass. But before he could kneel, a voice, unexpected, lilting, interrupted him. "You won't find the story you're looking for in there, you know." It was Miss Marple. Her presence, as always, was quiet, but never accidental. She wore her walking shoes, and a shawl slightly too heavy for the weather, and she carried with her a look, not of suspicion, but of readiness. Oliver straightened, the automatic smile forming on his lips, but fading slightly, when he saw the precision in her gaze. "Just enjoying the evening, Miss Marple." She replied, stepping closer, not looking at the hollow. "Funny how the evening enjoys watching back." He chuckled lightly, out of politeness, perhaps. "Do you often take walks this late?" "Only when the air feels wrong," she said, not as a joke. They stood together in silence, the kind that feels like a conversation between two people who know what not to say. The wind had picked up again, and this time, it carried a sound, like dry leaves brushing against something smoother than bark, not loud, barely audible, but enough to make Oliver shift. Miss Marple looked toward the village, where lights were beginning to wink out one by one. There was a time, she said softly, when no one dared come here after dark. Not because of stories, but because of what people remembered. Legends, he asked. Facts, she answered. Things that happened, people who stopped happening. He opened his notebook slowly, perhaps to write that line down, but something in her voice stopped him. You're not here for folklore, Mr. Brent, she said. You're here because you know something's been forgotten, and you think this tree remembers it. He hesitated, but then nodded. Once. The Annabelle case, he said finally. It wasn't just a disappearance, was it? Miss Marple's reply was not immediate. She looked at the oak, but not directly. Her gaze hovered just beside it, like someone afraid of meeting a stare that hadn't yet been cast. No, she said at last. It wasn't. And with that, she turned and left him there, standing alone in the hush of the night, while the tree behind him creaked once, no more than a whisper of movement, but enough to make the birds in the nearby hedge take sudden flight. That same evening, Reverend Hale dreamt of water. He had been praying when sleep took him, seated in the rectory study with his prayer book open but unread. In his dream, he stood beneath the oak, though the branches above did not seem to belong to any tree. They reached not toward the sky, but downward into the earth, as though craving it. The ground beneath him was wet, though the sky above remained clear. A soft chanting rose from nowhere, a language he did not speak, yet somehow recognized. And then he saw something rise from the hollow at the base of the tree. He did not remember what it was when he awoke, only that it smiled. When he stumbled to his feet, drenched in sweat, the prayer book lay closed, though he did not recall shutting it. And his shoes, still on, were caked in dirt. At the same time, in another house just beyond the post office, Arthur the gardener was cleaning his shears, not because they were dirty, they had not been used that day, but because they seemed to deserve attention. He polished them slowly, deliberately, then placed them on the table, and stared at them for several long minutes, his hands resting on either side, unmoving. His eyes did not blink. He looked at the blades, not with admiration, nor fear, but familiarity. When he stood, he did so too quickly. The chair scraped loudly, and on the windowsill, behind the lace curtain, something shifted, a face, gone before it was truly seen, and still the village slept. The postmistress, Mrs. Lenton, rose in the middle of the night, and claimed to have heard knocking, not on her door, but from inside her kitchen cupboard. The constable's dog refused to go near the path by the oak, pulling away with an almost human whimper whenever coaxed. And the little girl who'd been found crying at the fete, refused to eat anything not made by her own mother, insisting the sweets offered by Mrs. Green at the shop tasted like the tree. But none of these things were spoken aloud the next morning, not seriously, not as real events. The sun rose, the curtains were drawn, the newspapers delivered, and the day began again. Yet something in the rhythm had changed. People crossed the street more often, avoiding the side closest to the green. The grocer found his apples bruised, though they'd been fresh the night before. A book went missing from the library, an old volume of local pagan rituals last borrowed 23 years ago, and never returned, until now. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took to writing less, and listening more. She observed, she noted, she waited. Because she knew, there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And so the days ticked forward in that strange suspended quiet, sunlight still filtering through the hedgerows, birds still calling at dawn, the routines of St. Mary Mead persisting as though nothing had shifted at all. But it had. The air, though not colder, felt less welcome. The shadows, though not longer, now seemed to gather rather than simply fall. It was not the absence of peace, it was peace itself wearing a borrowed face. Oliver Brent continued his quiet inquiries. He smiled in the bakery, nodded to the vicar's wife, and listened with that particular stillness of a man who already knew what he was waiting to hear. He recorded interviews, most of which were dull, references to folk dances, May Day games, and a particularly embarrassing tale involving cider and a hedgehog, but occasionally, someone let something slip. An old man, muttering about how the fete used to be held in the north field, until the tree took someone.
A child who pointed at the bark and whispered. That's where they whisper their names. A diary found in a trunk in the attic of the hall, pages stuck together with mildew, but one passage legible enough to chill. We bury what we must. It is the only way the roots stay asleep. Arthur, the gardener, was seen once more near the oak. Not tending to it. No, he never touched it. But standing beside it, in the rainless morning, eyes closed, as though waiting for a command that would not be spoken aloud. And when he turned, his expression blank, someone, Mrs. Lenton, perhaps thought she saw something clutched in his hand. It may have been pruning shears, or it may not have been. Meanwhile, the Reverend Hale began skipping Sunday services. Once was excused, an illness. Twice, unusual. By the third week, whispers started in pews and drawing rooms alike. But the vicar gave no apology, no explanation. He was seen walking the footpath toward the rectory garden in the early hours, sometimes before dawn, never with shoes. When addressed, he smiled too quickly. And Miss Marple noticed the tremor in his hands when he reached for the sugar bowl, as though something inside him had become detached and was now floating just beneath the surface. The fete had passed. Yes, but its shadow lingered, and in the village, things began to move in subtle ways. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but like chess pieces nudged just slightly when no one is looking. A shop bell ringing without a customer. A clock that always stopped at the same minute when near the green. The echo of a child's laughter when no children were near. Miss Marple watched. Always watching. She no longer sat on her porch with knitting. She had taken to walks, early, deliberate, silent. She visited the library again, the church grounds, the post office, the cemetery. But always, her path led her near the oak. Never directly, never too close. But close enough to feel it. Because she too had begun to remember. There had been something, long ago. Something not in newspapers or diaries, but buried in childhood instinct. A girl's voice. A hand reaching for her shoulder and pulling her back from the base of the tree. No memory of who it was, but the feeling remained. Cold. Urgent. Protective. She had never gone near the oak again, not truly, until now. And as she walked the path that evening, clouds thick overhead, the first rain in weeks began to fall, not hard, not with thunder, but with a hush, as though the sky were ashamed to weep aloud. The earth drank eagerly. And the oak seemed to breathe. The moment it began was imperceptible. Perhaps it was the way the wind stopped suddenly, or how the air lost its birdsong. Or maybe, it was simply the silence. Not absence, but presence. The kind of silence that waits. At the edge of the green, Miss Marple stopped. Arthur stood 20 yards away, unmoving. Oliver Brent, behind her, and unaware she was there, was kneeling again by the hollow, camera raised, and from the rectory, a soft light flickered. Dim, then gone. She turned her head. The oak tree stood. And at its base, just barely visible in the wet grass, was something new, a small red ribbon. Tied in a bough, too clean to have been there long, and beneath it, barely distinguishable from the roots, was the imprint of something. A shoe. Small. Child-sized. Miss Marple did not speak. She did not call for anyone. She only turned her head to the side, ever so slightly, as if listening. Because she knew something now, something she hadn't admitted, even to herself. This wasn't beginning. It was continuing. It had never stopped. And somewhere, just behind the bark, something remembered her name. And so, dear viewer, if you have come this far, perhaps you feel it too. The hush between words, the echo of a truth not yet spoken. If this story stirs something beneath the surface, I invite you, only once more, to subscribe, and to turn on your notifications. Not for the sake of algorithms or numbers, but because this tale is far from over, and what comes next, I assure you, is not to be missed.
Chapter 2. A Cry Under the Oak. It happened just after dawn, though the light had not fully settled, and the village still wore its shawl of mist, as though reluctant to meet the eyes of the day. A silence hung in the air, not the peaceful kind that heralds a promising morning, but the sort that feels expectant, heavy, as though something had arrived first and was waiting to be discovered. The call came from a farmhand, young George Mellors, whose job it was to fetch eggs for the rectory's kitchens, and who, on that particular morning, chose a path he did not normally walk. The shortcut behind the green past the oak, and George, being of practical mind, had no concern for old tales. Trees, to his reckoning, didn't curse or claim. They stood and swayed and offered shade to those who could not afford better roofs. And yet, when George turned the bend, where the grass narrowed, and the tree stood like a monument to secrets not written in any church record, he stopped. Not because of what he expected to see, but because of what he did not. The birds. They were not singing. And then, as though led by instinct rather than curiosity, his eyes were drawn to the base of the tree, where a patch of earth had been disturbed. Not torn, not dug, but unsettled. And there she was, Eleanor Bishop, 18, a maid of no particular distinction in the records of the town, but known to most for her cheer, her laugh that seemed always a little too loud, and her fondness for red ribbons. She had been alive the day before. She had served tea at the vicarage. She had, in fact, been seen walking near the fete grounds that very evening, humming to herself. Now, she was lying at the foot of the oak tree, her eyes wide open, her mouth gently parted, her face serene in a way that no living person ever is. There was no wound, no sign of distress. Her hands, placed at her sides, were clean, her dress undisturbed, and around her neck, just visible beneath the collar, was a silver locket that gleamed as if untouched by the soil. George did not scream. He was not the sort. But he ran, and when he returned, it was with the constable, the vicar, and though no one quite remembers how she arrived so quickly, Miss Marple. She did not speak at first. She stood, her gaze fixed on the girl's face, then on the tree. The constable, eager to perform his duty, had already begun muttering about heart failure, common, he said, in girls who worked too hard, though the logic seemed to falter, even as he spoke it. The vicar knelt to say a prayer. George looked away, and Miss Marple, calm as ever, leaned down, and with gloved fingers gently lifted the chain that held the locket. She did not open it at once. That would come later. For now, she merely looked at the girl's shoes, clean, dry, laces tied. She looked at the tree, unchanged, unmoved, but somehow involved. And then, very quietly, she said, "Did anyone hear her cry?" No one answered, because no one had. They gathered at the edge of the green. As the morning unfolded, villagers who had not meant to be there, drawn as if by some wordless invitation. The whispers began almost immediately, and like most such things, they started softly enough, half-formed, uncertain, clothed in euphemism and caution. Eleanor had collapsed, perhaps a fainting spell, perhaps a passing illness, undiagnosed. Someone mentioned poor heart health in the family, though no one could recall her ever being ill. Another suggested fright, though of what precisely remained unspoken. But behind the murmurs, behind the cautious phrasing and lowered voices, another word took root. It passed between lips like a superstition, not yet disavowed. It was not shouted, or even stated with confidence, but it was said. The curse. Not the first time. Certainly not in St. Mary Mead, where memories outlast names and stories survive in the spaces between facts, but rarely spoken with such weight. The constable, a man more familiar with livestock complaints than untimely passings, announced with professional assurance that the young woman had simply succumbed to a natural cause, likely a seizure, perhaps exacerbated by heat or poor diet. He even mentioned that fear could stop the heart, though what she might have feared, he could not guess. And with that, the case was unofficially closed. But Miss Marple did not agree. She remained at the scene longer than the others, her eyes not on the body, which had now been respectfully covered, nor on the tree, which loomed without comment, but rather on the ground, on the pattern of footprints, or rather, the absence of them. Eleanor had come alone. That much was clear, but what remained unclear, what continued to scratch gently at the edge of Miss Marple's understanding, was why she had come at all. Eleanor had no family nearby. No romantic entanglements, at least none acknowledged. She had no reason to walk that path in the early morning, and yet she had stopped, not in panic, but in stillness. That was what struck Miss Marple most of all. There had been no struggle, no signs of distress, only acceptance. She asked quietly, without drama, if the locket might be opened. The constable hesitated. Protocol, decency, and a lack of imagination, all weighing equally on his conscience. But at last, with a nod from the vicar, and no objections from the girl's employer, it was done. The clasp gave way with a quiet click. Inside, a photograph, small, faded, but clear. A man's face, smiling faintly, perhaps in uniform, though the cut was foreign, the buttons unmarked. He was young, dark-haired, unfamiliar, and no one recognized him. Not the constable, not the vicar, not Miss Marple, and certainly not the town. The locket was gently closed again, and nothing more was said of it, but it was noted, quietly, precisely, as Miss Marple always did. She returned to her home that afternoon, later than usual. She did not pour her tea immediately. She sat at her desk, opened a small leather-bound journal with a cracked spine, and wrote one sentence. First, the silence, then the stillness, then the locket, and beneath it, smaller still, none of them heard her cry. The days that followed Eleanor Bishop's passing did not return the village to calm, though outwardly, everything appeared unchanged. The church bells still rang, the grocer still miscounted coins when distracted, and the children still played hopscotch on the cobbled road outside the vicarage. But beneath these small continuities, something had altered, not a disruption of life, precisely, but the shifting of its undertones, like a familiar song, played in a different key. There was a discomfort, not easily named, and as such, it was avoided, disguised as headaches, blamed on weather, tucked beneath polite refusals for invitations. The laughter at the tea shop was quieter, the eye contact during conversation briefer. Even the Reverend's sermons returned, though with less certainty in his voice, as though reading the same words now produced different meanings. He did not mention Eleanor by name, not once, but twice during the same service. He paused mid-passage, and looked toward the eastern window, and both times, Miss Marple saw his hand tremble slightly at the edge of the lectern. The coroner's report arrived 2 days later. Cardiac failure, natural causes, no signs of trauma, no substances in her system. The village, desperate for resolution, latched onto this. Young hearts did sometimes falter. It was sad, yes, and certainly tragic, but not unusual, not unexplainable. And so the story was made tidy, folded, and placed on the shelf of memory, where such things are kept, until the dust thickens enough that questions no longer rise. But Miss Marple did not forget. She could not, because she remembered something. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, and perhaps of no significance at all. But that morning, as she had leaned forward to examine the locket, she had noticed a mark on Eleanor's wrist. Not a bruise, not a wound, just a faint discoloration, as if something circular had been worn tightly, then removed. A watch, perhaps, or a bracelet. But Eleanor had never worn one before, and no such item was found among her belongings. More importantly, Miss Marple remembered the maid's expression, not one of surprise, not fear, something else, something akin to recognition, as though whatever she had seen, or heard, or felt, had not been foreign to her, but expected. She took tea that day with Mrs. Tilling, the baker's wife, who insisted on discussing the preparations for the harvest fair. Miss Marple nodded in all the right places, even agreed that the jam competition was bound to be fierce this year, but her mind remained elsewhere. When asked about the incident with Eleanor, she merely offered a quiet shake of the head. A tragedy, she said softly, but not an accident. Mrs. Tilling blinked, startled. But the report? Yes, said Miss Marple, quite. The report. That evening, Oliver Brent returned from a visit to the county archives. He had requested information on past occurrences in the village, specifically disappearances, unusual burials, and any mention of the oak tree in parish documents. Most of what he received was useless.
faded lists of land transfers, weather records, the minutes of church meetings from decades past. But tucked in the margin of a 1904 funeral register, next to the name Beatrice Crowthorne, were 4 words, scrawled in ink, that had bled into the paper. Found beneath the tree. No cause of passing listed, no inquiry recorded. Just those words. And beside it, a symbol, a hand-drawn circle, uneven, marked through with a cross. Oliver brought the page to Miss Marple. The next morning, she studied it with a calm expression, but her fingers held the edge of the page a touch too tightly. "Do you know what this means?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I know what it doesn't mean." And that she did not explain. By the week's end, the village had settled into that uncomfortable state where tragedy is neither resolved nor questioned, only acknowledged, then quietly folded into the fabric of everyday life. Eleanor Bishop's funeral was brief and simple. The church was not full, though those who came wore their grief in neat, well-managed expressions. There were no tears from family. She had none near enough to attend. And the mourning, such as it was, seemed more ceremonial than personal. Miss Marple attended, of course. She sat near the back, hands clasped neatly in her lap, eyes forward, but not quite focused on the pulpit. She listened to the reverend's words, softly spoken, and meticulously unchallenging. There were no mentions of the oak, no references to the unusual, only the expected phrases: rest, peace, sorrow, remembrance. But behind the hymns, and the floral arrangements, and the polished shoes, something darker was lurking. Not fear, not yet, but doubt. And in a village, such as St. Mary Mead, doubt, once planted, takes root more deeply than truth. After the service, Oliver Brent approached Miss Marple. Beneath the eaves of the church, he looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of understanding half a thing. He carried the funeral register still, the margins marked with new notes, and on a second sheet of paper, a copied entry from 1875. No name this time, just a description. A young girl, eyes open, found near the oak. No signs of violence, no explanation offered. She was said to have smiled. Oliver asked if Miss Marple believed there was a connection. She answered slowly, choosing each word with the care of a woman who knows that names have power, but so too does silence. "I believe," she said, "that we are looking not at separate threads, but at a tapestry. Only, we're still too close to see the pattern." And then she turned to leave. The conversation closed, not with dismissal, but with gravity. That night, the wind changed. The skies clouded over without rain. The air grew heavy, not with scent, but with something else, a pressure, a presence. And in her sitting room, with the fire lit low, Miss Marple opened Eleanor's locket once more, not to gaze at the photograph, but to examine what was behind it. The picture came loose with the touch of a needle, revealing a second image beneath it, fainter, older. The same man, yes, but this time, standing in front of the oak, his hand resting upon the bark, and at his feet, just visible in the background, a child, unsmiling, watching. And on the back of the second photo, written in looping hand, she said he taught her the names of the routes. Miss Marple sat very still. Outside, the village slept. But the silence wasn't empty, it was watching.
Chapter 3. Shadows in the Leaves. There are hours of the night which belong not to time, but to memory. The hours when the world appears unchanged, yet one's mind, unguarded by daylight, begins to see things differently. And it was during these hours, just past 3 in the morning, when the village of St. Mary Mead, though silent as always, no longer felt asleep, because, my dear listener, something was moving. The first to notice it was Mr. Clegg, the postmaster, a man of sceptical disposition and weak eyesight, who had risen earlier than usual due to a troubling dream he could not remember. He shuffled to his front window, pulled the curtain back with a grunt, and saw, just for a moment, a figure standing by the tree, not walking, not shifting, simply standing, as though waiting to be acknowledged. The light was poor, and the tree cast its usual deep shadow, but the outline of the figure was undeniable, tall, too still, and somehow unfamiliar. He blinked, it was gone. He said nothing of it the next morning, attributing the sight to a sleep-fogged brain. But 2 days later, Mrs. Jessup, returning late from her sister's home in Wellingford, spoke with hushed agitation about a shape she had seen crossing the path near the oak. She said it moved oddly, not with the rhythm of a person, but with a kind of gliding step, like someone whose feet did not trust the ground. And then came the third report, from the schoolteacher's son, no more than 10 years old, who said quite matter-of-factly that he saw a man outside their house at night, smiling without a face. When pressed, he could not elaborate, only that the figure had no eyes, no mouth, no skin, just light where the face should be. Such things, of course, are not mentioned in town meetings. They are repeated over back fences, in shops, and while folding laundry. They are softened in the retelling until they sound like nonsense, but still, they are remembered. And behind all of it, the oak tree stood. Oliver Brent, ever the observer, had begun sleeping less and walking more. His journal, once a tidy record of interviews and folklore clippings, had grown messy with sketches, none artistic, all compulsive, circles, trees, eyes, roots. He returned to the base of the oak each morning at sunrise, and it was on one of these walks that he saw it. A shoe, half buried, small, child-sized, old. The leather was worn but intact, the laces frayed, the sole thin from use. It had no pair, and there was no logical explanation for its presence. No child had been reported missing, and no one in the village claimed it. Yet it sat there, just beneath the roots, as though waiting. He picked it up carefully, wrapped it in a cloth, and took it directly to Miss Marple. She examined it without surprise. Her expression, as always, was one of deep attention masked by gentleness. "It's been in the ground," she said, "but not for long." He asked what she meant. "It hasn't rotted," she explained. "The soil here doesn't preserve, it consumes." There was a pause, long enough to feel heavy, but too short to invite questions. That same night, Reverend Hale was found wandering barefoot near the tree. His robe was wet from the dew, and his face was pale, not with fear, but confusion. He did not remember leaving his home. His feet were scratched, though not badly, and when asked why he had gone there, he only said, "I heard someone singing, a child. I thought it was a hymn." Miss Marple did not speak of it to the others, but she began, quietly, to search her shelves for something specific, and it was in the back of her study, in a drawer not opened for years, that she found it. A diary, old, bound in green fabric, water-damaged and incomplete. It had belonged to her great-aunt, and on the final page, torn, fragile, written in hurried script, was a sentence that made her breath catch. "They told me it was only the first blood sacrifice, but not the last." Miss Marple did not sleep that night, not out of fear. No, fear was not something she allowed to dictate her habits, but rather due to a sense of obligation, the quiet, invisible kind that only the truly observant carry. For there are moments in life when facts resist coherence, and in such moments, the responsible mind does not demand answers. It waits for them, like a gardener who tends the soil even before the seeds are sown. She reread the torn page again by lamplight. The first blood sacrifice. The words were clear, but the context remained elusive. There was no mention of a name, nor of a date, just that sentence, carved in ink with a pressure that left an imprint on the page beneath it. It was not written for others to read. It had been written in haste, or fear, or both. She considered the phrase carefully. Sacrifice implied ritual. It suggested intention, and more unsettling still, it suggested recurrence. The next morning brought little relief. A fog had rolled into St. Mary Mead, the kind that hangs low and thick, muffling sound and dulling color. Doors opened slower, footsteps echoed longer, conversations grew fewer. The tree, now almost invisible through the mist, seemed somehow more present than before, as if the fog had drawn attention to it rather than hiding it. Mrs. Jessup spoke again of the figure she'd seen, this time adding that she believed it had been watching her window. "Only for a second," she whispered, "but I felt it. It knew I saw it." Her husband dismissed it, but her hands trembled when she held her teacup. The vicar, Reverend Hale, had been found again outside, this time further along the path, closer to the woods. His sleepwalking continued, though he no longer seemed confused upon waking. In fact, he seemed calm, too calm. He described his dreams not with fear, but with fascination. "It's the same place every night," he said softly to Miss Marple. "Not here, but under, beneath. It's always beneath." Oliver Brent had taken to drawing. He said little now, preferring the company of his own notes. The shoe he'd found remained on Miss Marple's shelf, untouched, though she swore she once found it turned slightly, as though it had moved, or been moved. She told no one. By the week's end, 3 more people reported hearing things: footsteps without walkers, humming in the hedgerow, a light tapping against windows when the wind was still, and through it all, the oak remained unchanged, or so it appeared, but Miss Marple noticed. Its bark, once smooth in places, now showed markings, faint, like impressions left by fingers, not carved, but pressed, and at its base, where the roots met the earth, a small circle of moss had turned black. She did not touch it. Instead she returned to her study, opened her great-aunt's diary, and carefully turned the page beyond the torn one. Most of the writing was illegible, water-damaged beyond recognition, but in the corner, faint and fading, was a single word: Annabel. She remembered the name, a girl from long ago, the one who had vanished in 1875, and as she sat back in her chair, the fog pressing softly against her windows, she realized something that made her fingers still. Annabel had been the first, but not the last. St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its predictability, its hedges clipped, its paths swept, its days progressing with the orderly rhythm of a grandfather clock. But now, the rhythm had begun to falter, not dramatically. No one ran through the streets, no sirens pierced the morning air, yet something had shifted, subtly, and completely, like the tightening of a thread in a tapestry no one remembered weaving. People stopped lingering outside after dusk. Shopkeepers began closing a quarter hour earlier, without comment. Children, once so fond of gathering under the Green's oak for games of pretend and whisper chase, now crossed the village square, with eyes fixed forward, and voices subdued. It was as though a collective instinct had begun to settle upon them all, a quiet agreement, not to speak too loudly, not to look too long. Miss Marple, of course, noticed. She noticed the way the postmaster locked his front door twice now, even during daylight. She noticed the vicar's shoes, left by his gate each morning, damp from the grass, despite his protests that he had not left the house. And she noticed, more than anything, that the mist had returned, not nightly, but enough to linger in the minds of those who had begun to feel watched. And indeed, watched they were. Oliver Brent reported seeing a face, or rather the outline of one, in the bark of the oak. He'd gone to take photographs in the early evening, just as the light turned gold, and the shadows began to stretch, and when he developed the image in his rented cottage's bathroom, yes, he was old-fashioned like that, he found something unexpected. Not a trick of the light, not a smudge, but a face, long, narrow, unfocused, not smiling, not even alive. But there, when he returned the next morning, it was gone. The villagers, meanwhile, spoke less and speculated more. Eleanor Bishop's passing was not mentioned directly, such things were not repeated when children were near, but her name lingered in silence. People referred to the girl now, not out of disrespect, but from a kind of superstition. They avoided the path near the tree. Some began taking alternate routes entirely, even if it meant walking a quarter-mile farther. And those who had once defended the rational world began admitting, in hushed tones, that perhaps there were things that could not be explained by coroner's notes and police reports. Miss Marple received a letter that week, unsigned, unsealed, left at her doorstep. It was a single page, written in a careful, spidery hand. "I saw him too, 3:47 a.m. He is not alone." There was no return address, no indication of who had written it, but she believed it, because 2 nights before, she had risen early for her tea, and looked from her bedroom window toward the oak, and though she did not see a figure, she saw the shadow of one, not moving, not present in the way a person is, but there nonetheless, a shape that wasn't part of the tree, and yet wasn't separate from it either. The next morning, she returned to the base of the oak, and what she found there made her pause. Not another shoe, not another note, but a piece of cloth, small, torn, and unmistakably old, lace, handmade, and embroidered with a name, Annabel. She folded it carefully into her handkerchief, and said nothing, but in her study, later that day,
She opened the great-aunt's diary once more, and reread the final page, this time, with new eyes. The first blood sacrifice. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. The cloth sat on Miss Marple's writing desk beneath the afternoon light, though the sun had done little that day to chase the clouds away. It was a delicate piece, almost fragile in its softness, and yet it held more weight than anything she had uncovered thus far. The stitching of the name, Annabel, was neat, elegant, unmistakably old-fashioned, and now confirmed what she had begun to fear. These events were not fragments, they were echoes. She had not yet told Oliver. There would be time for that, perhaps too much of it. For now she chose silence, letting the facts simmer gently, as good truth often must before it can be digested. Outside, the fog had thickened again, not as a weather event, but as a condition of the village itself. The air no longer felt like air. It was something else entirely, and though the people of St. Mary Mead continued their days, their errands, their polite nods, and restrained gossip, there was no question in any mind that something had been disturbed, not by Eleanor's passing alone, not by the shoe, or the sightings, or the strange note, but by time itself, as if the memory of what once happened beneath the oak had begun to wake and stretch, and remember. The vicar was not in church the next Sunday. When visited at his home, he answered the door with unusual calm, his collar askew, his voice slow and musical. He did not speak of the sermon he had missed, nor of the scratches on his arm, thin, straight, almost symmetrical, as if left by something with purpose. Instead he asked Miss Marple, an odd question. "Do you think the tree dreams?" he said, and then closed the door. She did not knock again. That night, the mist returned thicker than before, and with it, a scent barely perceptible, like old soil, and lavender, the sort one finds clinging to the pages of books too long left unread. And Miss Marple, unable to sleep, took once more to her writing desk. She opened the diary for the final time. The page beneath the torn entry had been overlooked until now, creased into the spine, nearly illegible. She leaned close, tilting the light, and slowly, the words came into view. "He chose her because she listened. He chooses the ones who see, but he needs another, one more, before the root forgets." She closed the book. Her breath did not quicken, her eyes did not widen, but the room felt smaller than it had. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and on the green, just for a moment, the outline of a figure stood beneath the oak, watching unmoving, neither approaching nor withdrawing. Then nothing. The leaves fell still again, but the silence wasn't empty. It was watching.
Chapter 4. The oak's secret roots. To understand the present, one must occasionally walk backward, not with haste, not with fear, but with deliberate steps into the shadows of what has been, for there are truths that will not present themselves until they are recalled, not as tales, but as warnings. Miss Marple, never one to chase ghosts, found herself now tracing them, not the kind that rattle chains or flicker through mirrors, but the kind that embed themselves in patterns, in numbers, in soil. And at the heart of this particular pattern stood the oak, silent, towering, unchanged, and yet never the same. The cloth, bearing the name Annabel, still rested on her desk. She had examined it again by lamplight, careful not to disturb the fabric, and though the embroidery was precise, elegant even, there was something hurried in the thread tension, as if it had been stitched, not out of pride, but necessity. Annabel, a name whispered through time, a name that refused to be forgotten. She pulled the town's public records that morning, requesting access not only to birth and passing registers, but to council minutes, land sales, and most particularly, historical complaints. The archivist, a young woman with fingernails bitten nearly to the quick, offered Miss Marple the records with a quiet urgency, as though she too had begun to sense what others would not yet say aloud. The documents were old, some in ink that faded to memory, others rewritten from earlier ledgers, but the dates stood out, unwavering: 1825, 1875, 1925. And now, always the same season, always near midsummer, always without fail, beneath or beside the oak. In 1825, a woman named Eliza Morton disappeared during a festival near the tree. The investigation, if it could be called that, ended with a single sentence: presumed runaway, unmarried, reputation questionable. And yet, weeks earlier, she had submitted plans for a modest cottage near the edge of town, a cottage she never built. In 1875, Annabel Crowthorne, 9 years old, lost during the midsummer fete. No body, no clues, only a bonnet, found near the tree, and a patch of earth too soft for the season. In 1925, Edward Bramley, a gardener, employed by the Hall, vanished 3 days after a midsummer storm. His boots were discovered at the foot of the oak. He had no known enemies, no debts, no reason to leave. The report simply reads, weather conditions likely disoriented him, case closed. And in 1975, a maid, Florence Till, found collapsed, eyes open, face turned toward the tree, no injury, no evidence of foul play. Her silver brooch had been clutched tightly in her palm. When pried open, it revealed a photograph of her younger brother, who had passed away as a child, many years before. And now, in 2025, Eleanor Bishop, Miss Marple placed the dates in a line, noting the spacing, every 50 years, no variation, and in every case, a single constant. The oak, Oliver Brent, when presented with the records, said little at first. He scanned the names, the brief descriptions, the margins filled with Miss Marple's tidy sloping notes, and only after several minutes did he speak. "You think it's ritual," he said, not as a question, but with a scholar's curiosity. Miss Marple looked up from the locket, now open before them. "I think it's a record, not of incidents, but of obedience." He frowned. Obedience? To what? She did not answer. Instead, she turned to the map pinned on the wall of her study. An old map of St. Mary Mead and its surrounding properties, one she had kept since before the war. She traced a triangle between the locations of the original disappearances, Eliza's would-be cottage plot, the Crowthorne house, the old stone well behind the hall, the triangle's center, the oak. "There's something beneath it," she said quietly. "Something older than the tree, older than the village." That evening, Arthur the gardener was seen walking the edge of the green. He was not a man given to aimless wandering. Every step he took usually had the echo of a task behind it. Yet this time, he carried no shears, no rake, only a pair of gloves, held in his hand, not worn, and a look of quiet contemplation. At dusk, he approached the tree. He touched the bark, just once, and he was not seen again. Morning came with little fanfare, just the expected grey of an English sky, and the slow stirring of a village that pretended not to worry when one of its own went missing. But this time, the pretense frayed faster. Arthur's absence was noticed immediately, not because he was missed, but because of what he had left behind, his tools. Not discarded in haste, nor packed for travel, simply arranged on the bench behind the rectory, laid out with the neatness of a man who had not forgotten them, but rather left them as if he expected to return. Miss Marple visited the spot just before midday. She stood by the bench for several minutes without touching anything, allowing the scene to breathe its quiet truths. A trowel, wiped clean. Shears, oiled but unused. A flask of tea, still warm when found by the vicar's wife. No note, no footprints leading away from the path. No one had seen him after dusk, but the tree, Miss Marple thought, had. The locals, though unnerved, did what they always did when the unexplainable brushed against the tidy order of things. They recategorized it. Arthur had gone to visit family, some said. Others recalled he'd mentioned travel, though none could say when or where. Rumors filled the gaps, but behind each whisper was a question too large to speak aloud. Why the tree? Miss Marple began tracing not just the names but the time frames. Dates, yes, but also seasons, moon phases, festival days. And that was when the pattern revealed itself fully, not every 50 years by calendar alone, but by cycle. Midsummer. A solstice alignment. Every instance of disappearance or unexplained collapse coincided within 5 days of the summer solstice, always near the oak. Always when the tree cast no shadow at noon. She checked astronomical records, confirmed moon phases, compared weather entries from archived journals in the vicarage, pieced together fragments of forgotten rainstorms and sudden droughts. Each incident had followed a period of unseasonable stillness, days where the air felt heavy, and the wind paused. Nature itself had quieted before each vanishing. The oak, she now believed, was not just a landmark, it was a threshold. The great-aunt's diary, consulted again late that evening, offered a passage she had overlooked. One entry stood out, written in 1894, though referencing a tale far older. They hung her at the tree. Said she'd taken the boy. But she said the tree had called him, not her. She only followed. The boy's name was John, and he smiled when he vanished. Witch trials. Miss Marple had heard whispers of them, of course. Most had taken place elsewhere. Pendle, Bury, Wokingham. But some names had remained tied to local superstition. Old women, who had spoken out of turn, or whose cats lived longer than expected, or whose gardens grew too well when others failed. But this was not that. This was not fear of women. This was fear of what they said they saw. The oak, they claimed, had once been used as a hanging tree, not by the village's law, but by its fear, unofficial, quiet. A way to erase the inconvenient, and those hanged there were not only women. 2 children also had been among them, though no one could confirm if their names were recorded. The village had erased that page, collectively, and completely. But Miss Marple knew something about erasure. It never lasts. And now, the pattern was full. 1825, 1875, 1925, 1975, and now, 2025. Always in summer, always someone young, always beneath the tree. She drew the dates in a circle on her map, marked them, studied them, and in the center again, always the oak. She sat back, closed her eyes and listened. Not for sound, but for stillness. And in that stillness, something waited. It is one thing to recognize a pattern, and quite another to admit what it implies. Miss Marple, never one to indulge the fantastical, had learned long ago that human behavior, even in its most inexplicable forms, followed structure, intent, and often repetition. But the question was no longer if a pattern existed, it was why. Why the tree? Why the exactness of the years? Why the silence? Oliver Brent was the only one she shared the full diagram with. Names, dates, and now a collection of village map overlays, showing where the roots of the tree had likely spread across generations. He studied it quietly, leaning over the desk, his finger trailing the lines of connection. It's not just the events, he murmured, it's the places. Look where each incident occurred. Those were all village boundaries once. The tree was on the edge of something. She nodded. And now it's at the center. He glanced up, unsettled. What does that mean? Miss Marple closed the diary, her hand resting on the cover, as if to silence something beneath it. It means it was never only about what was lost, it was about where they were taken from, and where they were taken to. Later that evening, he returned to the tree alone, against her suggestion. He told her he needed to see the base again, needed to photograph the soil more carefully. He would not touch anything. He promised. Just document. It was a mistake. By the time the village clock struck 10, he had not returned. The fog returned with him, or rather, without him. It swept low and full across the green, clinging to the houses and muffling sound. The tree, visible from Miss Marple's window, loomed larger than it should have in the moonlight. Its bark shone faintly with dew. Its leaves did not stir, though the wind moved gently through the hedge, and at the base, where Oliver had knelt only an hour earlier, something had been left, not by him. By it, a camera. Its strap twisted, the lens cracked, half buried near the roots. She sent word to the constable quietly. No panic, no accusations, merely a statement that Mr. Brent had not returned from a walk, and was last seen heading toward the green. No mention of the patterns, no mention of the rituals, and certainly no mention of the word she now feared she would be forced to speak soon. Sacrifice. Because what began as coincidence had revealed itself as cadence, and cadence meant intent. The camera was not returned to Oliver Brent, nor was Oliver Brent returned to the village. By morning, his name was on the constable's notepad, though written with the same pen and under the same heading as Arthur the gardener's: the missing, the misplaced, the unexplained. And as Miss Marple,
stood once again at her window, she realized something deeper than disappearance was taking place. People were not just vanishing, they were being exchanged. She spoke no further of rituals, nor shared the pattern with anyone else. Her diagram was folded, placed beneath a drawer false bottom, alongside the cloth bearing Annabel's name, and the first page of her great-aunt's diary. Not out of fear, no, never that, but because, like the oak itself, she now understood, some things watched in silence, not to threaten, but to endure. And what endured here was old. Older than this soil, older than the village's name, not evil, not precisely, but ancient, hungry, precise. It was Mrs. Tilling who first noticed the gardener's absence. She'd come to collect herbs for a roast, and had waited outside the greenhouse for 10 minutes before knocking, lightly, politely, only to find the door ajar. The greenhouse was empty, his apron hung on the hook, his gloves rested on the bench, still marked with soil, and beside the door, in the flower bed, the rosemary had been cut with clean precision, half pruned. A task abandoned. He had been seen only an hour earlier, near the tree, pruning. Miss Marple arrived before the constable. She walked the edge of the green without speaking, stepping lightly across the dew-soaked grass. It had rained, though no one recalled clouds. And there, just at the tree's base, not obvious, not intended to be found, was something glinting in the light. A button. From his waistcoat, black, brass, inscribed with the gardener's former regiment, information he had once shared on a spring day, casually, as he trimmed the hedgerow, outside the post office. He had survived a war, he had said, seen things men were not meant to see. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought now, this made him familiar to what waited beneath the tree. She bent slowly, picked up the button, and placed it into a small tin in her pocket. Then, standing upright once more, she looked up. The oak did not sway, its bark did not creak, its leaves did not fall, but something had changed, imperceptibly, quietly. She would not speak of it. Not yet, because there was still more to see, more to uncover, and the final page, unwritten though it remained, had already begun forming in her mind. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And somewhere, deep in the roots where no light reached, it was listening.
The Chapter 5. Echoes. In the well. There is an unease, peculiar to places once believed forgotten, where the overgrowth of time serves less as a curtain than as camouflage, a way for memory to hide in plain sight. St. Mary Mead, for all its polished hedgerows and measured quiet, held such a place, not on the maps, not mentioned in walking guides or fond remembrances, but known nonetheless, known by those who remembered what they were not meant to speak aloud. And Miss Marple, that morning, remembered. She had been thinking of Arthur, of Oliver, of Eleanor, and the others, but more than them, she had been thinking of what remained, not only the locket and the cloth and the camera, but of something far older, a place, a name, the old well. It was not marked, not anymore, and yet she remembered it as clearly as if she had stood beside it yesterday. It had once been on the edge of a boundary, behind the vicarage stables, before they were torn down and replaced with a row of cedar hedges. It had been sealed when she was still a girl, after a boy had fallen or been pushed, depending on who one asked. And after that, it had been forgotten. Quietly, intentionally, she put on her boots without ceremony, laced them slowly, gathered her satchel with her notebook, gloves, and torch, and left the house by the rear gate. The path she took was not paved. It was an old foot track, softened with moss and shaded by a canopy of trees that should not have grown so thick in that corner of the village. The air beneath those branches did not move as it should. There was no breeze. The birdsong ceased before the first bend, and still, she walked. It took her 15 minutes to reach the well. It was not a dramatic sight. No stone arch, no wooden frame, just a circle of old bricks, sunken slightly in the earth, covered in ivy and tangled roots. But she knew it immediately. She removed her gloves and knelt beside it, brushing the moss away from the edge. The surface crumbled more easily than expected, too dry, too brittle. When the last layer was pulled back, the opening was revealed, narrower than she remembered, darker and quiet, not empty. No, never that. But listening, she lowered the torch first, angling the beam downward. The light revealed only a few feet at first. Stone walls, uneven, descending in a narrowing spiral. Then something glinted. Metal. She extended her reach, keeping her footing balanced, and angled the torch again. There, half buried beneath scattered leaves and soil, was a ring of something, bone white, curved, too smooth for stone, too old for wood. She fetched the small garden claw from her satchel and worked gently, loosening the surrounding debris. It took her 10 minutes. When the object was free, she drew it up into the light. A jawbone, human, small, and beside it, 2 others, one larger, one not, and further down, just at the edge of her light, the unmistakable silhouette of a child's shoe, its toe still tied with a bow. She did not speak. There was no one to hear, but behind her, the branches of the trees rustled without wind. Miss Marple did not call for help. She did not return to the village in haste. Instead, she remained kneeling beside the well, surrounded by damp earth and time-worn brick, as though caught in a kind of reverent paralysis, not of fear, but of recognition. For here, finally, was confirmation of what she had long suspected, that the disappearances were not merely vanishing acts, but removals, placements, echoes deposited, where no one would think to look again. She took out her notebook, turned to a clean page, and wrote, "Remains found. 3, at least. 1 child. Bone density suggests age variance. All beneath the well mouth. Left deliberately." She paused. Then no animal could have placed them so precisely. She made no attempt to extract the shoe. It had been placed, positioned, even, with too much care. A warning, perhaps, or a tribute. She stood slowly, joints stiff with age, though she felt her body more as a witness than as an obstacle. Her eyes drifted once more to the circle of bricks, and the moss that clung stubbornly to its edges. There were words there, scratched, not carved. At first, she mistook them for root damage, but as her fingers brushed the edge, she saw them clearly, if faintly. Letters, in a script older than her own memory. Blood for roots, silence for peace. 4 words, 4 truths. She traced them once with her finger, and then stepped back. By mid-afternoon, she had returned home, and placed the jawbone in a cloth, not for preservation, but for reflection. She would not report it, not yet. There was more to understand, and the village was not ready. It had not been ready in 1825, nor in 1875, and it would not be ready now. Instead, she turned her attention to the living. She paid visits, not directly, not with confrontation, but with tea and gentle inquiry. To the constable's mother, who still remembered her grandfather muttering in sleep during midsummer storms. To Mr. Crawley, the clockmaker, who once found a page torn from a hymn book and pinned inside the door of his grandfather's music chest, marked only with the words, "Offerings unspoken hold longer peace." To Mrs. Finch, 93, and still sharp as clover wine, who, when asked if she remembered the old well, said nothing for a full minute, before whispering, "So they've come again then," and staring, unblinking, toward the window. Miss Marple made no reply. Miss Finch leaned forward, her hands trembling around the teacup. "It happens every time we forget, every time we pretend we didn't see. But we did, we saw it all." She hesitated, then added, "It always starts with the tree, but it ends in the well." And with that she broke, not loudly, not theatrically, just one sound, small, shuddering, and then silence. A silence that wasn't empty. It was watching. By the following day, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had changed, not in its appearance. Indeed, the hedges remained trimmed, the post arrived on time, and the baker's bell still rang promptly at noon, but in its temperature of spirit, a stillness had deepened. Even the sound of the church bell seemed somehow farther away, as though muffled by distance that wasn't physical. Miss Marple walked the village with new eyes, not searching for clues in the conventional sense. No, those had already presented themselves, but for confirmations, reactions. She studied faces, movements, hesitations in speech, and what she saw told her what the words of the villagers would not. They knew, perhaps not all, and perhaps not in ways they could articulate, but enough of them had seen something, remembered something, or heard it whispered once at bedtime, and never spoken again. And yet, when asked directly, they fell silent, except for one. Mr. Aldous Gray, former parish treasurer, and the eldest man in St. Mary Mead, by record, though his age was given differently depending on which neighbour one asked. He lived in the old cottage beside the livery, now shuttered and mostly ignored, surrounded by ivy and forgetfulness. Miss Marple brought scones, a peace offering of sorts, and was welcomed in with little more than a nod. The sitting room was filled with dust and time. A fire was lit, though it was not cold. Miss Gray did not sit so much as settle into his chair, and when she mentioned the well, he did not feign confusion. He closed his eyes, and then said, softly, "They say it was built over something else, not a spring, a pit, a place they used long ago, before they called it a village. Before the chapel." He paused, then opened his eyes. "The children used to dare one another to go near it. One didn't come back. They said he ran off." "I know better," Miss Marple asked, gently. "What do you know?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, and whispered, "It's happening again!" The words did not feel dramatic, they felt inevitable. She left the cottage without asking more. There was nothing more to be said. She had found bones, she had found silence, and now she had found acknowledgement. She returned home, and placed a torn slip of paper into her notebook, retrieved earlier that morning from the pew of the old chapel, buried beneath the hymnal stack. It had no page number, no identifying markings, just a passage. Blood for roots, silence for peace. The same phrase from the well, and now repeated, reinforced, revealed. The roots, she realized, were not just those of the tree, they were the history, the choices, the sacrifices perhaps, made willingly, or not, and the silence, that was protection, or punishment. She no longer knew which. Miss Marple spent the remainder of that day, not with others, but with silence. She sat by the window of her modest sitting room, tea cooling beside her untouched. The locket, the jawbone, the cloth, and now the torn hymn page laid out before her like relics at an altar. She did not arrange them, but let them remain where they fell, as though they might speak more freely without the interference of human order. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the green, and for the first time in many days, the oak tree was not fully visible through the misted window, only its outline. And somehow, that was worse. She rose before the final light left the sky, and crossed the room to retrieve her walking coat. There was one last visit to be made, not to a person, but to a place. The church. Inside, it was colder than expected, and darker than it should have been, even at dusk. She did not switch on the electric lights. She walked by instinct, by memory. She passed the font, the altar, the second pew from the front, the one where Eleanor had once sat, and then toward the back wall, behind the organ loft. She found what she had been hoping not to find, an old bookshelf. Moved, just slightly. The mark on the floor beneath it was unmistakable, dragged, not for cleaning, not for maintenance, moved for access. Behind it, a hollow in the wall, not a tunnel, not a passage, a gap, a space no longer than a man's arm, filled with discarded hymnals, candle stubs, and most tellingly, a box, small, tin, rusted along the hinges. Inside the box was a folded sheet, paper, brittle, and on it, words, handwritten. "He calls through the roots. The tree remembers those who were promised. If they are not given, it takes instead." Below that, a list of names: Annabel Crowthorne, Florence Till, Edward Bramley, Eliza Morton, and at the bottom, just written in a hand fresher than the rest, Eleanor Bishop, the 5th. Miss Marple folded the paper back into the box,
and replaced it gently. She moved the bookshelf forward, restored the order, stepped back. The church creaked, but not from the roof, from the floorboards beneath her feet. Later, as she sat by the fire with her notebook open and her pen still, she added a final line. There is always a fifth. But perhaps there was a sixth. She did not know yet who that would be, or if they had already gone. But behind the veil of time and village habit, the pattern waited. Not to be solved, to be completed. And somewhere, in the stillness between roots and rain, the echo of the well whispered back.
Chapter 6. The Disappearance of Reverend Hale. There is a kind of hush that only exists in churches, not the silence of libraries, nor the quiet of forgotten corridors, but a deeper stillness, one made of breath held, time paused, and memory pressed gently between the stones. And it was in such a hush that the Sunday service in St. Mary Mead began, late by 2 minutes, and with the organ slightly out of tune, as it always was in autumn. The congregation, modest but familiar, had settled into the pews with their usual grace. Miss Marple, seated 3 rows from the front on the right, had already noticed the absence of young Matthew, a cold, the overly perfumed arrival of Mrs. Wycliffe, new lilies in her garden, and the unusual tightness in Reverend Hale's step as he approached the pulpit. He wore his robe as he always did, pressed, ceremonial, just a touch too large in the shoulder. But today, his fingers toyed with the sleeve edge more than usual, and his eyes, though cast toward Scripture, never quite met it. He began the sermon with a reading from Isaiah, chapter 55, the passage about things returning not void. But his voice lacked weight, lacked conviction, as though each word had become unfamiliar, even as it passed his lips. Miss Marple, ever the listener, heard the breath between phrases and noted the pauses not meant to be there. And then, quite suddenly, he stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, his hand hovered in the air as if he meant to turn a page, but the page was not there. A murmur ran softly through the pews. He blinked once, then again, and then turned, not toward the vestry, not toward the altar, but toward the rear doors of the chapel. He stepped down from the pulpit with careful slowness, as though descending into something, not merely the aisle. His footsteps echoed once, twice, and then he was gone, gone. No door opened, no sound followed, just absence. The robe he had worn lay crumpled on the center aisle, neatly as if placed, but no longer filled. Not a gasp, not a cry, just stillness. Miss Marple did not move, not at first, nor did anyone else, because what had happened was not just sudden, it was impossible. The chapel did not erupt in panic, as one might expect from such a moment. No one screamed, no one ran. The silence that followed Reverend Hale's disappearance was of a different kind, profound, suffocating, composed not of confusion, but recognition, as if a long-expected event had finally taken place, and those present were left with the shame of having hoped it would not. It was Miss Marple who moved first, not to speak, nor to comfort, but simply to rise and approach the robe which lay gently pooled on the stone floor like a serpent shedding its skin. She knelt beside it, not out of reverence, but observation, and noted that it was still warm, not damp, not scorched, but warm, as though its wearer had only just left it behind. No note was found, no sign of resistance, no disruption in the pews or the aisle. It was as though he had stepped into another room, one invisible and immediate, and had not returned. By the time the constable arrived, the parishioners had been quietly ushered outside. No one wished to remain indoors, though no one said why. The robe had not been touched. Miss Marple stood nearby, composed, her eyes scanning not the pulpit or the altar, but the stained glass window above the chancel, where a narrow beam of light struck the floor at an unusual angle. The constable, red-faced and whispering too loudly, muttered about heart conditions, concealed exits, and nerves. Miss Marple did not correct him. She merely raised one hand and said, "There are cameras now, are there not? In the church." Indeed there were. Installed 2 months earlier, after a string of petty thefts from the offering box, minor, forgettable, mostly symbolic. The recordings were rarely reviewed, until now. The footage was pulled that evening. The local officer, a young man with trembling hands, brought it directly to the vicarage study, where Miss Marple waited with her notebook, and the faintest trace of lavender still clinging to her sleeves. They watched together in silence. The video began normally, congregants arriving, Reverend Hale stepping into frame, his sermon beginning. Then, the moment, the flicker. Not static, not interference, but something more deliberate. The video, clear and color-balanced, just seconds before twitched. Not once, 3 times, in rhythm. And then frame by frame, they watched Reverend Hale step from the pulpit, walk 5 measured paces down the aisle, and begin to fade. Not disappear, fade. As though the space around him had grown heavier, and his outline had been absorbed into it. His face did not show alarm, only focus, almost recognition. And then in the final second, just before the robe fell, the footage slowed, not by the viewer's control, but on its own. The frame lingered, the screen dimmed, and there, in the corner, near the vestry, just behind the door, something else appeared. A shape, tall, bent slightly forward, not walking, waiting. The screen went black, the file corrupted, irretrievable. Miss Marple sat still for several moments before standing. She thanked the constable quietly. Then, without explanation, she asked to be let into the church once more, alone. Miss Marple did not speak of the collapse, not to the constable, who waited outside, and noted the paleness of her complexion, not to the housemaid who later brought her tea, and found it untouched for hours, and not to herself, not in the way most would, not in words, nor justifications, nor shallow dismissal. Instead, she returned home that evening, in silence, and sat beside her hearth, where the fire had long since gone to ash. Her hands, still firm, held the teacup gently, but it remained unmoved, as though the porcelain itself could sense that nothing boiled within it would soothe what had begun to stir in her. For what she had seen in the church, no, not seen, been shown, had not been a hallucination, not illness, not exhaustion. It had been an invitation, not warm, not cruel, just necessary. She opened her notebook again, and turned past the maps, the names, the jawbone sketch, and the phrase, blood for roots, silence for peace, and began a new page. At the top, in ink darker than the rest, the root system spreads. Beneath it, Hale did not leave. He was taken, or absorbed. She paused, then underlined a word, consumed, and then another, returned. She knew now that Reverend Hale's disappearance was not an isolated phenomenon, nor even a consequence of curiosity. It had been a progression, a requirement, a continuation of something that had not begun this year, or this century, but far earlier, before prayers were written in English, before the chapel had walls, before the village had a name. And now, for the first time, it was not only Miss Marple who felt it. Whispers began to thread their way through the village, not of gossip, but of unease. Doors were bolted, not from caution, but instinct. Children were kept inside before dusk, not from fear, but from something colder. And each night, the oak remained, still, but larger, as though the land beneath it breathed differently now. And behind the chapel walls, the growth spread, unseen, uninterrupted, as it always had. For there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting. If you have remained with us this far, then you too feel the shift, the weight of something unexplainable folding into place. Consider subscribing, quietly, discreetly, to ensure you do not miss what comes next. There are still chapters ahead, and the darkest one waits at the end. Chapter 7. The Whispering Tree. In a village like St. Mary Mead, stories told by children are rarely taken seriously, and yet they are never entirely dismissed either. Their truths may be tangled in play, or stretched by imagination, but somewhere beneath the coloured chalk and whispered games, something real often lingers just out of reach. And so, when the children began saying the tree talked at night, most adults responded with the usual blend of smiles and silence. Mrs. Grayson laughed politely when her grandson whispered it across a breakfast plate. Mr. Tilling shrugged when his niece refused to walk the green after dusk. And Miss Marple, who, unlike the others, had already begun to listen for things that did not want to be heard, did not laugh at all. She simply noted the time of the first claim, 8:42 p.m., and the weather, dry, windless, cool. It was not a child who told her directly. It was a drawing, handed to her by young Catherine Jessup during a garden visit that had, until then, involved little more than jam tarts and a scolding of ants. Catherine, bright-eyed and precise in her own odd way, said nothing as she passed her paper across the table. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her mouth remained still. The drawing showed the oak, but not simply its shape. It showed eyes, dozens of them, drawn into the bark, half hidden behind twisted branches. Faces, elongated and thin, were sketched into the knots of the trunk, and beneath them, scrawled in red pencil, were 3 names. One was Eleanor's, one was Arthur's, and one was Marple. Miss Marple looked at the child without alarm. "And did the tree say anything to you?" Catherine hesitated. "It didn't say," she whispered. "It remembered." That evening, Miss Marple returned to the green alone, well past sunset, carrying with her a thermos, a torch, and an old handheld tape recorder, one she had kept since the late 70s, tucked behind tins in the cupboard where few would look. She set herself at the edge of the tree's shadow and waited, not for movement, for sound. The wind did not rise, the grass did not stir, but the recorder clicked once. Then again, she pressed play. Nothing. Then on the third attempt, a sound, not a voice, exactly, not syllables, but a rhythm, whispers, soft, uneven, unnatural, and within them, the shape of words, not spoken, but formed. She leaned closer and heard it. Her name, clear, precise, as though remembered, not by a voice, but by the ground itself. It is one thing to suspect that something watches, quite another to hear it speak, and not with the clarity of dialogue or confession, but with the murmur of something older, something incapable of forgetting, even if it has no tongue, no lips, no voice of its own. That night, Miss Marple heard the whisper of her name, carried not by wind, but by stillness. The tape continued to roll, and with each second, the sound shifted, soft phrases layered under the static. Not sentences, not language in any familiar sense, yet there was rhythm, and beneath the rhythm, names, some familiar, some long forgotten, some not yet spoken aloud in this life. She sat without fear, but not without awareness, because this was not a haunting, it was an accounting. The tree did not cry out. It recalled, and what it recalled, it did so with precision. At 2:12 a.m., she rose from the bench beneath the oak. She rewound the tape and placed it gently back in her coat pocket. She looked up, not at the branches or the canopy, but at the bark, and for a moment, no more than a breath in length, she saw it, a face, half-formed, smooth, eyeless, not smiling, gone. She left in silence. The next morning, she brought the drawing to the vicarage, though no vicar remained, and laid it beside the list of names, now pinned discreetly to the inner wall of her study. The names were growing, not simply those confirmed missing, but others, old ones pulled from registers dating back to 1724, where 4 parishioners were recorded as having disappeared during a lightning storm, while gathered in silent contemplation at the tree. 4 names. No weather records from that day noted any storm. Miss Marple returned to the chapel, this time during daylight, and found the pew where Catherine's cousin had once sat, the one who'd claimed she'd seen a man without a face. The hymnals were undisturbed, the dust unbroken, but there, tucked behind the spine of "Lift Up Your Hearts," she found a torn slip of music parchment. No staff lines, no melody, just a symbol, a red ring, hand-drawn, rough, uneven, and at its center, a knot, not a spiral, not precisely, but something close. She did not show it to the constable, nor to the librarian, nor even to Catherine's mother, who had begun to whisper to neighbors that her daughter now spoke in her sleep, and not in her own voice. Instead, Miss Marple returned home, and waited for nightfall, because she knew what came next would not arrive through inquiry, it would arrive through witness. That night, the wind did not return, not to the trees, nor the chimneys, nor even the tall grass beyond the green. What moved now was not air, but attention, the kind that cannot be seen, but is nonetheless felt, on the back of the neck, in the pause between footsteps, in the sudden stilling of birds mid-song. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, her notebook open, her pencil steady, her eyes not on the page, but on the tree. She had returned the child's drawing to its place on the mantel, not out of sentiment, but as a kind of warning, not to others, to herself, because what the drawing showed was not symbolic, it was literal. At 11:47 p.m., she stepped outside. She walked not directly toward the oak, but around it, circling, as if testing the gravity of a planet. She noted where the grass had thinned, where the ivy had returned, where the ground was no longer dry, though no rain had fallen, each detail noted, not in ink, but in breath. And then she saw it, not on the tree itself, but at its base, paint, fresh, red, a ring, imperfect, hastily done, but unmistakable, painted around the base of the tree in a wide circle, as if marking not territory but completion. It had not been there before dusk. No brush was found, no footprints, just the ring, and at its edge, a single object, a pebble, no larger than a coin, smooth and grey, marked with a line, not natural, carved. She knelt, and heard it, a sound not in her ears, in her bones, a murmur rising from the roots, not in pitch but in presence. It did not beg attention, it commanded it. She stood slowly, and turned back toward the village, where not a single light remained on, not in the post office, not in the schoolhouse, not in her own home. The power had not gone out, the lights had been extinguished, by choice, and though she could not see who had done it, she knew they had all heard it, and they were afraid. Miss Marple did not return home that night, not out of fear, that had passed. She remained instead on the edge of the green, just outside the painted ring, standing with her back to the village, and her eyes fixed on the oak. She did not speak aloud, though her lips moved slightly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in reckoning, perhaps in quiet disbelief that even now, she was beginning to understand, because it was not just a tree, it was not just a place, it was a memory, anchored in bark, etched in the soundless breath of soil, and whatever had been spoken into it, sacrifices, secrets, songs, remained echoing, not forward in time, but downward into the roots where language slept, but meaning endured. She waited until first light. The whispers stopped, just before dawn, not because the voices were gone, but because they had said what they needed. Her name had been among them, so had Eleanor's, and Florence's, and Annabelle's, and one more, unspoken, but not unknown. She returned home, just after 6, the sky barely touched with color, and listened to the recorder again. This time, the whispers came clearer, too clear, not distorted, not random, one voice, multiple names, and not one of them had been spoken by a child. She placed the tape into her drawer, next to the cloth, the locket, the jawbone, and now the red-ringed slip of paper. That evening, Catherine Jessup arrived again at her doorstep. She carried a new drawing. This one showed the tree again, but the eyes were closed now, all of them, and where before there had been names, there was only a red spiral, drawn around the roots tightening inward. Miss Marple looked at it, nodded once, and asked did the tree say anything else. Catherine hesitated, then whispered, only one thing. What was that? The child did not blink. Soon, that night, Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat in her armchair, notebook open, fire cold, and in the distance though faint, the whispering returned.
Chapter 8. Buried Truths. Unearthed. It was not uncommon, in the archives of St. Mary Mead's administrative building, to find dust older than the people who stirred it. The records room, rarely visited, sat 2 floors below ground, and was only accessible by a narrow iron stairwell that had not been repainted in decades. The smell was of mildew and paper, with a faint undertone of resignation. It was here that Oliver Brent, the journalist whose name would soon be scrubbed from village memory altogether, had once spent an afternoon, perhaps his last unremarkable one. He had been researching timelines, piecing together threads the way historians often do, too far from emotion, too near to logic, and had stumbled upon a drawer marked Inquest Files, Rural 1870, 1970, suppressed. The label alone gave him pause. Suppressed, not sealed, not classified, suppressed. As if the village itself had gently pressed its collective thumb against a page and held it closed, he opened it. And what he found did not shout. It whispered. There were folders. Dozens, none in alphabetical order, all stamped with ink that had faded, re-inked, then faded again. Names repeated, locations echoed, and one word, written on no official form, but scribbled in pencil across multiple margins. Tree. He began to read. The earliest case, 1831. A girl, 13. Found at the base of the oak, eyes open, face peaceful, no marks, no wounds. Declared inconclusive. Then again, 1881. A man this time, local mason, vanished during the harvest. Body discovered days later, seated upright at the foot of the oak, hands folded, eyes removed. Not gouged, removed. No investigation, no arrest, no cause given. He turned another page, then another, and there, near the bottom, dated 1925, was a name that made his hand stop moving, Florence Till. And beside her file, another, unmarked, no date, no official stamp, just a photograph, paper clipped in. It showed a young girl, 17 perhaps, wearing a maid's uniform, head tilted, locket visible. Her face was Eleanor Bishop's, but it was not. Because the photo was from 1925, Oliver Brent had never believed in the idea of recurrence, at least not in the mystical sense. History, he often said, was an echo chamber of choices, not fate. But now, holding a photograph nearly a century old, staring into a face he had known, one that had laughed in the rectory kitchen, that had walked too close to the tree with sweets in her pocket, he began to feel something pull at his understanding. Not contradiction, not wonder. Something colder. She looked exactly like Eleanor. Not similar. Identical. He turned the photo over. No name. No inscription. Just a stain in the corner, where water had once crept through the file box. He laid it beside Florence Till's autopsy report. Cause of passing indeterminate. Position found, seated, upright, beneath the oak. Clothing, uniform, locket, shoes polished. Notes, eyes open, mouth relaxed, hands folded over stomach, exact, down to the detail. He did not take the photo, he left it there in the drawer. He did, however, make a note in his journal. Same girl, 1925 and 2025. No record of birth, no record of burial. Later that day, the constable, whose voice had grown less certain over the past few weeks, confirmed something quietly to Miss Marple. Yes, he said, eyes lowered. There were others, the record, some of them. They've been moved. They're there, but not in the place they should be. And it's not by accident. She thanked him and did not press further, because she already knew the truth had not been lost, it had been buried by the village. Not by its government, by its people, piece by piece, year by year, with tea and silence, and the ritual of not asking too many questions. Miss Marple returned home that evening, and sat again before her map of the green. The pattern of events, once plotted by distance and time, now gained a new dimension: faces. Repetition of form, reappearance of expression. People re-emerging, not merely in memory, but in body. Not reincarnation, something else, something between presence and possession. The photograph of Eleanor, in 2025. The photograph of the maid in 1925. Two names, one face. She made a new page in her journal, titled it simply, Inheritance of Form, and below it, in smaller writing, do the roots remember faces, or do they keep them? At precisely 9:36 p.m., a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find no one, only a note, folded, no envelope, pressed under a stone, 5 words. He's returned. but not right. And beneath that, an address, the Finch house. She did not run, she walked, and what she found changed everything. The Finch house was a modest 2-story cottage, with ivy crawling up its stone flank, and a hedge so neatly trimmed it appeared sculpted rather than grown. Mrs. Finch had not called the constable. She had not alerted the neighbours. She had, in fact, done nothing beyond sending the note, because what she had seen did not lend itself to explanation. Miss Marple knocked once, was not answered, then entered quietly through the unlatched door. The smell hit her first. Not rot, not illness. Something, fungal. Dampness, without moisture. The scent of cellars long sealed. She stepped through the front hallway, and into the parlour, where the curtains had been drawn, despite the late hour, and the fire burned low with no flame, only coals, smouldering. Mrs. Finch stood beside the armchair, her eyes red, her mouth a tight line of silence. She gestured once, wordlessly, and then moved aside. And there he sat. Arthur, the gardener, returned. Or what was left of him. His hands were folded in his lap, motionless, his boots still caked with soil. His coat torn, not by force, but wear, like it had been worn for far too long in the same place. His beard was thicker, though only slightly, as though time had passed differently around him. But it was his eyes, or rather, the absence of them, that stopped Miss Marple's breath, not gouged, not injured, gone. Cleanly, smoothly. 2 soft depressions, where the eyes had once been, as though erased by a hand too careful for violence. He did not speak, he made no sound, but his mouth moved once, as if trying to remember what words were, and failed. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. Arthur, she said, not as a question, but as an invocation. He turned his face toward her. Not sharply, not with recognition, but as if the name itself pulled at a thread inside him, something that might have once been his. His lips parted, and from somewhere deep in his throat came a sound, not a word, a rasp, as though something within him had been buried under earth, and was now trying to push through. She did not ask questions. She did not weep. She only looked once, long and quiet, and then placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It was cold, and trembling, and then at last, he moved. His fingers lifted, slowly, blindly, and he traced something on the armrest beside him. A shape, a circle, with one line curling inward. Miss Marple did not draw it again. She didn't need to. It was already on the map. Miss Marple remained at Arthur's side for nearly an hour. No words were exchanged. None could be. The man she had once known as meticulous, almost meditative in his manner, had returned hollowed, not just frightened, not only altered, but visibly frayed around the edges of his self, like a book too often opened at the same page, until the spine gives. He could not see her, but he seemed to sense presence. Her warmth, the silence she carried differently from others, not to avoid truth, but to measure it. By the time she left the Finch house, the streets were still. Too still. Not empty. Just listening. She returned home, and unpinned the diagram from her study wall. The map, the dates, the names, all of it had grown too dense, too tangled to be useful as a diagram. It was no longer a reference, it had become a warning. She laid it across the floor, and began rewriting it, not by timeline, but by shape, by the formation of events, by the rituals implied, but never spoken. 5 disappearances, 1 returned. Every 50 years, always the same type, a girl, a servant, a root system rediscovered beneath fiction. She rewound the tape recorder, and played it again, and this time, she heard something new. After the names, after the whispering, a space, a breath, and then, a 6th name, spoken in a language that was not language, but known all the same, not written, not seen, but inevitable. She did not write it down, she knew it would appear soon enough. At that moment, a soft knock echoed against her door, not hesitant, measured. She opened it, and there stood the constable, pale, breathless. In his hands, a folder, old, stamped, UN filed. He opened it without waiting. Inside, a photo. A girl, 17, uniformed, locket visible. It was not Eleanor. It was not Florence. It was not a duplicate. It was a pattern, repeating,
refining. And there, at the bottom of the page, in faded ink, believed resemblance intentional, source unknown, pattern predicted to continue. Miss Marple's fingers trembled for the first time, because the report had been written in 1975 and signed, A. Gardner. She looked up from the paper, but the constable was gone, and outside, the wind had stopped again.
Chapter 9. The Root of Evil. It had not rained, yet the ground was damp, not with dew, nor with the careless trace of fog, but with something older, as though the earth itself had begun to sweat. It was on this morning, quiet but alert, that Miss Marple stood before the doors of the village library, not to borrow, not to browse, but to search for the truth. Now had narrowed its path, and it led down. She had come not on instinct, but information, passed in the form of a fragment, a single sentence written in the margin of the old autopsy ledger, discovered after Arthur's reappearance. The note, faint and spidery, was unsigned, but not without direction. The sixth name lies beneath the shelves. At first, she had thought it metaphor. Now, she was less certain. The librarian, Mrs. Dunnett, had not arrived yet. Miss Marple let herself in. She had always been trusted with keys, and that trust had never been questioned. The reading room was as it always had been. Rows of old county records, journals, forgotten railway guides, an outdated encyclopedia, set that no one dared move for fear the shelf might collapse out of protest. But it was the back wall that drew her now, behind the faded genealogies and sermon anthologies, where the wood was warped ever so slightly, the grain mismatched. She pressed gently. It gave a thin breath of air, cold and sour, whispered out from the gap, as though the library itself exhaled. The panel slid aside with little resistance. Behind it, stone steps, narrow, descending, no signage, no torch. She lit her own. The air grew colder with each step, and when she reached the base, she knew what it was, even before her torch found the shape. A chapel, not Anglican, not consecrated. Something else. Older. It was not large. No altar, no crucifix, but symbols etched into the stone, curved lines, circles that bent where no compass could draw, and one, repeated across the wall and into the floor, a shape, a ring, with a line, curling inward. She knelt, brushed away dust. Beneath it, another symbol, carved into a stone plate, set into the ground. Red pigment still lingered, as if recently refreshed, and nearby, beneath a loose stone, she found a book, bound in thick leather. No title. Inside, drawings, diagrams, and language older than anything held upstairs. But a few pages had been translated. One bore a heading, "The Binding of the Witness," and beneath it, "One must remember, so the rest can forget." Her hands grew still. The next page listed names, no roles. The girl, the gardener, the one who speaks, the witness, and beside each, a date. The last line was unfinished, just a dash, and beneath it, her own name, written cleanly, deliberately. Miss Marple. She did not faint, she did not tremble, she only turned the page, and found the symbol again. But now, painted in blood, the binding was not frayed, the ink had not faded, the pages were not brittle. This book, whatever name it once held, had been kept, preserved, not by accident or neglect, but with purpose. It had not aged with the chapel, nor with the earth beneath it. It was waiting, or perhaps it was simply too deeply connected to the pattern to age at all. Time, Miss Marple was beginning to realize, did not function here as it did elsewhere. She did not touch the painted page. Even her fingers, so steady in the worst of storms, seemed to hesitate at the edge of it. The symbol, painted in red, dried and clean, was identical to the one found around the oak, but this time, it was framed in a ring of names. Not all were legible, but hers was there again, not scrawled, not inserted, as warning, written as if it had always been part of the design. She looked around the small stone room. There were no pews, no pulpit, but in the far corner, behind a column of carved rootwork stone that twisted like wood, there was a small alcove. Inside, candles,
long burnt, and beside them, a mask, not a ceremonial mask, not of metal, or bone, or ivory, wood, oak, polished, featureless, except for the outline of a face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, and above it, scratched into the wall, one phrase, witness to remain, witness to remember. She stepped back. This was not merely history, it was architecture. It had been constructed, not just beneath the library, but within the village, woven into its stones, its traditions, its disappearances. This wasn't a haunting, it was a contract, a repeating vow, and now, she was the next one to bind it. She looked down once more at the page where her name appeared, and beneath it, a final newer line, had been written in a shakier hand, once named, the witness cannot unsee. The root is memory, the root must feed. She closed the book carefully, and just as she turned to leave, she heard it, not the whispers, something worse. A voice, calm, old and unmistakably hers, reading the next name. She did not cry out. There was no need. The voice, her voice, unmistakable in its timbre and cadence, had spoken not into the room, but into her. Not as echo, nor memory, nor hallucination, but as recording, one she had never made, and yet one that bore every inflection of her speech, calm, measured, undeniable. She listened. It repeated, only one name, hers it, then silence, and not the ordinary kind. The strained hush of a world, paused breathless. The candle flames had long died, and yet the air remained thick with the memory of light, as though shadows were still being cast by things unseen. Miss Marple stood alone in that chamber of carved stone, beneath the very place children came to borrow fairy tales, and elders came to borrow time. Yet here, in the rootwork beneath it all, no fiction remained, only memory, structured like ritual, and she understood now what it meant to be named, the witness. She was not chosen, she was assigned. The book had not called her, it had waited for her. She folded the book shut, and replaced it, where she had found it, though she knew now that its presence would not remain secret much longer. Not once it had revealed the name. The earth, beneath the chapel, seemed to hum faintly, as she stepped back up the stone stairs, not with sound but with sensation, as though it had been expecting her exit as much as her arrival. By the time she emerged into the library, the morning light had shifted. It was brighter than it should have been, sharper, the kind of clarity one only notices after long darkness, and for the first time, Miss Marple did not find it comforting. She made no immediate note in her journal. Instead, she returned to her home, sat by the fire, and began to gather everything, every object, every page, every sketch and record, not to hide, but to prepare. She now believed the village had not forgotten the rituals of the root, they had hidden them from themselves, unconsciously, as protection, each generation closing one more door, sealing one more crack in the story, until only the symbols remained, misunderstood and reshaped as local superstition. But the oak remembered, the well remembered, and now, so did she. It was late in the evening, when she opened her drawer and removed the child's drawing again, the one with the faces in the bark. She had not noticed before, at the base of the tree, just beside the locket drawn in red pencil, was something small, almost an afterthought. A book, closed, and beneath it, a circle, drawn around a pair of shoes. Her own. Miss Marple did not leave her home that night. She sat beside the fire, the light turned low, the air unmoving. Her notebook rested open in her lap, but she did not write, not yet. Some truths, once seen, cannot be recorded immediately. They must first settle into the bones, like weather or roots. She understood now that the binding was not metaphor. It was not poetic language preserved in forgotten pages. It was literal. The witness, according to the ritual, was not meant to prevent the pattern, nor to halt the taking. The witness was to observe, to name, to remember, to keep the history intact when the village itself refused to. She was not meant to stop the sacrifice. She was meant to stand beside it, and then to become it. The phrase returned to her, over and over, not as thought but rhythm. One must remember,
so the rest can forget. The first time it had sounded like duty, now it sounded like surrender. Outside, the air was thick with the weight of midsummer, still no wind. No birdsong, only the tree, dark and immovable, rising in the moonlight, like a memory that would not loosen its grip. She stepped to the window. The red ring around the base had faded slightly, but only slightly. The roots that extended from it were visible now, exposed by a sudden softness in the earth, not rain-washed, but shifted, as if something beneath had stirred. Then came the moment. A shape, at the base of the tree, not moving, not facing her, but unmistakably real. A figure, standing, barefoot, with arms at its side, as if waiting. No face, just the suggestion of one. And then, the second figure appeared. Behind it, smaller, stooped, carrying something. A book. She stepped away from the window, turned off the lamp, and opened her notebook. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "There was one truth left unspoken." Beneath that, "It has now spoken." And then she turned the page, not to write, but to wait.
Chapter 10. The Night Watchers. It is often said that villages sleep easily, wrapped in the rhythm of routine and the softness of silence. But St. Mary Mead had not slept in days. Not truly. Doors were closed early, lights extinguished, not from tiredness, but intent. The stillness of night no longer offered rest. It had become something else. A signal, a summons. Miss Marple, watching from her parlour window in the early hours of the morning, began to notice it, first not in motion, but in absence. Certain lights that once burned softly in upstairs bedrooms were now dark. Certain chimneys, previously cold, now showed signs of midnight smoke. There were fewer footsteps by day, fewer idle chats in front gardens, fewer questions asked, because she realized more was being done. At night, it was on the fourth evening, precisely, at 2:13 a.m., when she first saw them. Figures, 3, at first, then 6, cloaked, not in garments, but in darkness itself, moving silently across the green. They did not linger, they did not speak. They approached the oak, encircling it with the quiet reverence of those returning to something they had never truly left. She watched from behind her curtain, breath still, pencil in hand. She made no assumptions. Not yet. Only marks, positions, gestures. She saw the way one bent at the base of the tree, how another stood back with hands raised, not raised in fear or threat, but in offering. It was not prayer. It was participation. And then, the most jarring detail, one she nearly missed, the face of the one who stood furthest to the right, obscured, but not unfamiliar. Angular jaw, crooked nose, pale brow furrowed in that same particular way. It was the vicar, Reverend Hale, returned, not as before, but changed. She rose quietly, crossed the room, and retrieved her notebook from the mantel. She opened it to the page marked, the 6th name, but did not write there. She began a new one, titled it, The Watchers. She wrote, "They gather, at the base of the tree, in the second hour. Not all are from the village. One is Hale, he chants, and beneath that, what is being protected, or what is being sustained?" Because as she watched them stand still, and lift their hands to a tree that had seen every disappearance, every quiet burial of truth, every echo of sacrifice, she could not tell which it was, warding off something outside, or feeding something already within. The next morning came not with clarity, but with concealment. The sun, though visible, cast no warmth. Shadows lingered longer than they should have, and even the dew seemed reluctant to evaporate from the grass. Miss Marple took her walk at the usual hour, stopping by the post box and pausing at the green, not to observe, but to note. Her observations were not idle now. They were her only resistance. There were no signs of the night gathering, no footprints, no objects, no markings, except one. At the base of the tree, partially hidden beneath a fold of ivy, a thin cord had been tied, red, cotton, wound tightly, not by weather, but by hand. She did not touch it. Instead, She circled the green twice, noting which houses had curtains drawn, which chimneys still emitted faint trails of smoke at midday, which windows remained shuttered despite the absence of rain. And then, at the corner of the lane, she saw Mrs. Tilling. The widow had always been prompt, gardening by 7, errands by 9, tea by 3:30. Today she walked with her head low, hands clasped before her, lips moving, just slightly, not in greeting, not in prayer. Miss Marple offered a gentle good morning. Mrs. Tilling did not respond. She merely nodded, and passed by. And as she did, Miss Marple heard the whisper, so faint it may not have existed. Soon, that evening, Miss Marple returned to her window. The oak was still, the air stagnant, and at 2:11 a.m., the watchers returned. This time, there were more. 9. All robed in ordinary clothing, yet moving in ritual. One carried something beneath their arm, square, wrapped in cloth. Another dragged a sack, its contents unseen, but weighty. They did not speak, but they chanted. She could not understand the words, not for lack of clarity, but for lack of recognition. The syllables had shape, rhythm, purpose, but no known tongue. The cadence rose, then fell, not in worship, but in repetition, as though the tree had taught them what to say, and they merely recited. And then, as she leaned closer, too close, she saw him again. Reverend Hale, bareheaded, barefoot, and smiling. The smile did not match the man she remembered. It did not carry warmth. It was not offered to others. It was worn like a scar, permanent, without source. He lifted his hands, spoke a final phrase, and the gathering stilled. The air shifted, not with sound, with attention, and at once the entire group turned, not toward the oak, but toward her window. She stepped back, heart calm, but breath short. Had she been seen? No, it was not sight. It was something deeper. She closed the curtain, and waited. Morning returned, as it always did, but not as it should have. The world outside her window resumed its pattern with unsettling regularity. Mr. Dawes swept his stoop. The postman walked his path. A child's bicycle turned its wheels slowly, where it leaned against the butcher's fence, and yet the rhythm was wrong. Not broken, just slightly off, the way a song sounds when sung by someone who remembers the notes, but not their meaning. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. She did not eat. She did not read. She examined the latch on her door. It had not been moved. The curtains, undisturbed. The gate, untouched. But the air, different, heavy. Inside the parlor, a new scent lingered, faint, earthy, not rot, fungus. She followed it toward the sitting room, and stopped. There, on the floorboard by the threshold, faint but visible, 3 marks, drawn not in paint, nor dust, but chalk, red, not bold, just 3 small downward-facing lines, slanted, deliberate. She crouched beside them, careful not to breathe too deeply. The shape was unfamiliar in form, yet deeply recognizable in intent. It was not vandalism, not mischief. It was a mark. She stepped outside. The street was quiet, too quiet, and then she turned back toward her own door, and saw it, there, just above the knocker, drawn in the same red chalk, a circle, incomplete, with a single line curling inward. She touched it lightly. The powder smudged, but did not fade, not fully. Someone had marked her, not her home, her, not as warning, as declaration. That night, she would not wait by the window. She dressed warmly, packed her notebook, and left before the watchers could gather. She would not watch. She would listen, from the shadows, not to spy, to understand. She moved silently across the edge of the green, and slipped behind the stone bench where children once played in summer, and there, cloaked in dark, she waited, and they came. Not just 9, more, 12, 15, and not only those from the village, strangers, faces unfamiliar, expressions unreadable, and among them, the vicar again. His mouth moved, his arms lifted, and the tree seemed to breathe. The breath of the oak was not made of wind, nor warmth. It did not rustle branches or bend grass. It simply existed, pressing outward from the trunk in waves too subtle for the body.
but too ancient for the soul to ignore. Miss Marple crouched low, shielded behind the old bench, her breath slow, her thoughts faster than ever. She watched the watchers. They stood not in circle, but in segments, points, each positioned along invisible lines, as though marking the limbs of something immense buried beneath the earth. Their positions were not random, they were anatomical, as if forming the outline of a body that had no form, only memory. And at the center, Reverend Hale, his voice still not English, still not any language she had ever studied, spoke with unnatural clarity. Each syllable struck the air with precision, shaped like notes from a hymn composed by silence. No one joined him. They listened, they nodded. One by one they placed objects at the base of the tree: a shoe, a lock of hair, a folded piece of cloth, a book with no title. And then they all turned again, toward her, not toward the bench, toward her. Their faces did not change. They did not call out, they simply waited. And Miss Marple felt it. Then, not fear, not guilt, recognition, as if she too had stood in that place before. Perhaps not in this life, perhaps not in memory, but in the ritual. She stood slowly, did not run, did not speak. She stepped out from the shadow, and no one moved. They only watched, and behind them the bark of the tree shifted, not physically, not like muscle or wind-tossed wood, but in impression. She saw her own face there, not sculpted, not carved, remembered. When she returned home, the chalk mark on her door was gone, washed away, not by hand, by approval. They no longer needed to warn her. She was part of it now. Later that night, she opened her notebook once more, turned to the last blank page, and wrote only one sentence. There was never a choice. She closed it, and outside the watchers remained, not as intruders, as keepers.
Chapter 11. Miss Marple vanishes. There is a kind of silence particular to villages that have learned to forget. It is not the silence of grief, or of caution. It is the silence of performance, a carefully arranged tableau in which smiles return too quickly, and eyes turn away just slightly too soon. It was this silence that blanketed St. Mary Mead. The morning Miss Marple was not seen. That was how it began. She was not seen. The sun rose. The milk was delivered. The baker opened. The paper arrived. But Miss Marple's curtains remained drawn. The kettle did not whistle. The latch did not lift. It was Mrs. Finch who noticed first, pausing as she passed the garden gate. Her usual nod toward the window went unanswered. She hesitated, stared a moment too long, and then walked on. By noon, the village had resumed its rhythm, but something had shifted. Because everyone noticed, and no one asked. I arrived just after dusk. My own inquiry had brought me back to the village, drawn by what I couldn't name. A kind of pull not dissimilar to gravity, but less explainable. I had not spoken to Miss Marple in several days. Our last meeting had been quiet, brief, and strange. She had handed me a slip of paper with only 3 words written on it. You will know. At the time, I believed it cryptic. Now, I believe it inevitable. Her door was locked. No sign of forced entry. No overturned books. No broken furniture. But on the writing desk, her notebook, open, its last entry. The witness remains until taken. And beside it, her glasses, folded. Not broken, but missing one lens. As though someone had picked them up, snapped the right frame clean, and laid them back down carefully. An interruption, not of anger, but of finality. It was not until the footage was retrieved, 2 days later, that the truth began to make itself visible. The local council had installed a motion-activated camera on the corner of the chapel, across from her cottage, meant to deter youth from scaling the cemetery wall. It captured movement at 3:19 a.m., a hooded figure, tall, deliberate, entering through her gate, no hesitation, inside for precisely 6 minutes, then out again, alone. The figure carried nothing. But in the final frame, as it stepped beneath the shadow of the oak, something in the light shifted, not in brightness, in shape, like roots, moving beneath the earth. I remained in her home well past midnight, reading not for answers, but for patterns. Miss Marple had never written with flourish. Her hand was small, tight, sparing with punctuation. But each sentence carried weight, and the later pages, those scrawled in darker ink, with corners bent and paper worn, read like preparation, not for travel, not for retreat, for removal. There was no farewell, no goodbye, no mention of fear, only notation. If the witness does not observe, the pattern breaks. If the pattern breaks, the ground opens. Better it be one. Beneath it, a final phrase. It will not hurt. I turned off the lamp, stepped outside, and made my way to the green. The oak stood as it always had, unchanged in form, but not in meaning. The grass around its roots had not grown back since midsummer. The red ring, once faded, now appeared darker, as though recently refreshed, and in the light of my torch, just beside the trunk, I saw something half buried in the earth. A glint. I crouched, swept back the top layer of soil. Her glasses, not folded this time, broken. One arm snapped clean at the hinge, the missing lens still lodged in the frame, the other arm bent, as if twisted, not by accident, but intention. And there, beside it, etched faintly into the bark, her name, not carved, pressed. The imprint shallow, but unmistakable, as though the tree had remembered her. I returned to the village, and spoke to those who should have cared, the constable, the librarian, the postmaster. Each nodded politely, muttered platitudes. She's likely taken rest. Perhaps she's with family. She's often quiet this time of year. Lies. All of them. Lies told not with malice, but necessity. Because if they admitted her absence, they'd have to admit the tree. And so the village smiled. Lawn chairs returned to porches. Children played. The vicar, yes, the vicar was seen on Tuesday walking the path behind the chapel, humming something that no one recognized, but no one questioned. Because the moment you questioned, you saw it. The truth beneath the soil. In the week that followed, not one official inquiry was opened, not one leaflet printed, no posters, no public calls for aid. Even the village notice board, once cluttered with forgotten recipes and dog-walking rotas, bore no mention of her name. But her absence echoed louder than any headline might have. Because things began to change, the green grew quieter, the well long sealed, was found uncovered, though no one admitted to it. The librarian began closing an hour early, and twice refused to speak when I asked about the hidden room beneath the shelves. She simply shook her head, and walked away, her face pale, her jaw set not in confusion, but refusal. And then the dreams began. Not mine. The villagers, one by one, they came to me, quietly, ashamed. They whispered of visions, of a woman in grey, standing at the base of the oak, holding something in her hand. Sometimes a book, sometimes a root, sometimes nothing at all, always silent, always watching. The children called her the tree's lady. They spoke of her gently, not fearfully. One child, Catherine, brought me another drawing. It showed the oak, but this time, with a door at its base, a wooden one, with hinges made of bark, and standing at the threshold, Miss Marple, not frightened, not lost, waiting, not to be found, to be understood. I returned to her house that evening, and read the final pages of her notebook once more. On the back cover, written not in her usual hand, but pressed faintly, as if copied from elsewhere, was a line I had not seen before. The witness is not taken, the witness accepts. It was not an abduction, not quite. It was succession. I did not return to London, not immediately. Her home remained as she left it, clock wound, pantry stocked, firewood stacked in preparation for evenings that would no longer be hers. I found no letters, no keys left for safekeeping, no instructions, but I found a name scrawled in the margin of one of her older notebooks, written so faintly that it required the edge of my torch to reveal it. My own, just once, no context, no message, only a line beneath it: when I go he must remain. It was not a plea, it was a passing of burden, and perhaps, of understanding. The villagers never broke their performance. They greeted me with courtesy, asked after my sleep, offered tea, asked about the weather, but none of them asked if I had found her, because none of them needed to. They knew. And I,
no longer a guest, but a participant, began to see them as she had, not as conspirators, as caretakers, of the tree, of the pattern, of the forgetting. And so it was that I found myself, 1 week later, walking the green in darkness, alone, or so I believed. The tree loomed as it always had, immovable, untouched, but not silent. The wind, absent for days, stirred slightly in the canopy, a low hush, and with it, a sound beneath the soil, not footsteps, a breath. I placed her broken glasses, recovered, cleaned, wrapped in cloth, at the base of the trunk, and as I stood, I saw something glinting near the roots, a page, folded, unmarked. I opened it, blank. But when the wind turned again, faint lettering began to emerge, as though summoned not by ink, but by memory itself, and there it was. There was one truth left unspoken, and then beneath it, it has chosen another. I did not speak. I did not run. I returned home, and waited.
Chapter 12. The Return. It was on the third morning that the curtains parted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet parting of pale fabric in the upper front window of the Marple residence. Mrs. Finch, on her daily route to fetch bread and decline gossip, looked up from her basket and stopped mid-step. The hand had drawn the curtain aside slowly, no different from a dozen other mornings, but the hand had not been there yesterday, nor the day before, and for 3 days the village had maintained its silence. She said nothing. She did not call out. She simply watched as the curtain fell back into place, then turned, carefully, and walked home. By the time I arrived, word had not yet spread. The postman said nothing. The librarian, when I asked if she had heard anything, only replied, "Everything's as it should be," but something was different. The door to her home was unlocked. Inside, nothing had changed. Books still in order, teacups stacked, fire grate, swept, no sign of force, no sign of struggle, and there, seated precisely where I had last seen the empty chair, was Miss Marple, alive, unharmed, unchanged, and yet, nothing about her was the same. She looked at me as I stepped across the threshold. Her eyes were clear, her face composed, but there was a pause in her smile, not hesitation, not effort, restraint. She offered no greeting, only a gesture toward the seat opposite hers, and one soft phrase, "You came." I nodded. She nodded in return. There was tea, already made. The house was quiet, and the air was still, not stale, not fresh, as if the atmosphere itself had been waiting in place, unmoved by time. She poured one cup, then another, then looked at me, and said, "Some truths belong to the roots." I did not respond, because what she had said was not a metaphor, it was instruction. She would not say where she had been. She did not claim confusion, nor offer comfort. She answered no direct questions, only responded to presence, as if the act of returning were explanation enough. And perhaps, in its own terrible way, it was. I remained for the better part of the morning, sitting across from her, asking nothing that could be answered, and everything I suspected she had already buried. She spoke only twice more, once to say, "I didn't resist," and once again, when I reached for her notebook, still resting on the mantel, "Don't read it." I froze. Her voice had not risen. It did not carry warning, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that makes you feel not frightened, but watched, not by her, by something behind her. That evening, the smoke rose, thin, steady, pale grey. I stepped outside and crossed to the garden. There, just beyond the kitchen window, Miss Marple stood beside the bin where she burned garden clippings each autumn. The notebook, once filled with sketches and lines and names the world refused to remember, lay open in the flames. She did not watch it. She did not shield it. She simply stood and waited. The pages blackened, curled, collapsed, and then she turned to me and smiled. A different smile than before. Not fond, not evasive, final. "I've written everything I ever needed to forget," she said.
And then she returned indoors. The next day, she resumed her walk, the same coat, the same cane, the same turn of the garden path. But she no longer stopped to observe the postbox, or the green, or the faces of those who greeted her. She nodded, but she did not see, not the way she used to. She no longer solved, no longer watched, because watching had taken something from her. Or perhaps, it had revealed something she had always known. The village welcomed her return, with precisely the sort of politeness one might expect. No fanfare, no probing, not even an errant whisper at the grocer's. It was as if her absence had never occurred, or rather, as if it had been expected, and her reappearance fulfilled something quietly arranged, long before she herself had known to prepare for it. But it was not merely her speech that had changed, it was her purpose. For Miss Marple, whose very name had become synonymous with scrutiny, with delicate inquiry, with threads pulled gently from the hems of quiet lives, had stopped asking questions, entirely. Mrs. Tilling, who once relied on her to identify the culprit behind a stolen hedge trimmer, now received only a polite shake of the head. Mr. Dawes, who had misplaced his pension cheque, was met not with suspicion, but with a gentle shrug. She did not deny her ability, she denied the need. When pressed, gently and respectfully, over tea, I asked her why. Her answer came without hesitation. "There are things," she said, "that were never meant to be uncovered." "And you found them?" I asked. She did not nod, she only looked toward the window, where the oak stood silent beneath the dusk light. "Not found," she whispered. "Remembered." And in that word, everything changed. Because remembering, I realized, was at the heart of it. The village did not forget by accident. It forgot by design. And now, Miss Marple remembered too much. She was not afraid. She was bound. That night, I walked past the oak. The red ring was gone, the roots undisturbed, but something new had appeared at its base. A line of small, smooth stones, arranged in a shape I did not recognize, but felt I had seen before. Not a warning, not a ritual, a boundary, and inside it, a single item, a page of lined paper, blank, except for one phrase, in her handwriting. No more questions. I remained in the village another week. I did not ask her again, about the diary, about the time away, about the mark once drawn on her door, that no longer needed to be. There was nothing she could have said that would have answered what I now understood, in ways too old for words. The rituals had stopped. The watchers no longer gathered. The vicar gave his sermons again, shorter now, more thoughtful, and somehow older in the voice than he had ever been in the face. And yet, the village was not free. It was settled, the way a grave settles after rain. Each day, Miss Marple walked her path, pausing now and then at familiar corners, but not looking for anything, not reading hedges or gestures, or the twitch of a curtain, not piecing together what had come undone. She no longer lived among mysteries, she was the resolution, and what had returned in her was not fear, it was completion. She spoke rarely, always gently, always smiling, but never curious. Curiosity, she seemed to suggest, was a luxury for those who did not yet understand the cost of answers. The tree remained, still, whole, and sometimes, though only sometimes, the children swore they saw her in its bark, not as a face, not as a carving, just a shape, familiar, watching, not them. The roots, the ones that whispered once, and now no longer needed to, because she was there, and she remembered.
Chapter 13. The Final Sacrifice. I waited until the third night of stillness, before returning to the green. It had been quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that does not signal rest but readiness. I had passed by the oak many times since her return, never crossing the invisible line marked in chalk, ash or memory. But tonight was different. Something had changed. I had felt it in the way Miss Marple looked at me that morning, not pleading, not warning, but resigned, as though I had already made my choice, and all that remained was for the path beneath me to open, and open it. Near midnight, as I moved slowly around the tree's northern base, My foot struck something hollow. A sound not of root or rock, but of wood, deliberately placed, covered by moss and thyme. I knelt, brushing back the undergrowth, and found a panel, rotted at the edges, still firm at the center. A hatch, latched, but not locked. It opened inward with a low groan, and beneath it, a shaft, rough cut, stone-walled, ancient. It descended in a tight spiral, barely wide enough for my shoulders. No ladder, just footholds, carved into the wall. I hesitated, then lowered myself inside. The air changed almost immediately, not foul, not cold, but wet, saturated with something too thick for breath and too quiet for sound. I took each step carefully, my recorder strapped to my chest, already running. I had only brought one torch. It flickered once, then steadied. At the bottom of the shaft, a tunnel stretched out, uneven, earthen, pulsing with a kind of pressure I could not explain. Not pain, not fear, something waiting. The floor was packed soil, the walls, root-laced, not overgrown, inhabited, as if the roots had grown inward, not outward, reaching toward something central, something buried. And then I saw it. Ahead. Faint light. Not electric. Flame. A chamber. I stepped inside, and everything changed. The chamber beneath the roots was not large, but the weight it held made it feel immense. The walls were damp, darkened by years, perhaps centuries, of breathless history. The torchlight caught surfaces, shapes, edges, grooves, revealing a space built not by hand, but by memory. It felt less constructed than conjured. In the center, a stone slab, not natural, placed, polished with age. It bore markings, not decorative, but instructional, rings within rings, lines drawn with painful precision. I approached, and saw what I had feared to see since first arriving in St. Mary Mead. Bones, arranged deliberately, not scattered, not buried, displayed. Skulls rested atop femurs, ribs curved around a smaller central shape that I at first mistook for sculpture. It was not. It was a girl's skeleton, small, arms folded, locket still around the neck, the same locket Eleanor once wore, or perhaps the same girl. Again and again. I moved slowly, raising the recorder to my chest. My voice, when it came, was flat, controlled, detached. This is Brent Oliver, recording at 2:31 a.m. Beneath the oak, chamber discovered under the northern root. Symbols, unfamiliar. Bones, multiple, arranged. This is not a burial site. This is an altar. I paused, because I had said the word I did not want to say. And behind the altar, cut into the stone itself, a basin, shallow, darkened. I leaned in. The stain at the bottom was not dust. It had depth, clotted at the edges, and though I told myself it could be anything, I knew what it was. I backed away, and then, a sound. Footsteps. Above. No. Closer. From the tunnel. I turned. Too late. A shadow moved across the wall. Then, another. And another. I stepped back, toward the chamber's edge. Heart racing. Recorder still live. The tunnel behind me, filled with shapes. Hooded. Familiar. One held a lantern. One held rope. None spoke. But from the darkness came a voice I did know. The vicar. Calm. Measured. You're not meant to see this. Then, everything went dark. The torch was taken first. The light vanished, but not the sound. The recorder, pressed tightly to my chest, kept running. You must understand. I did not scream. I did not plead. The moment had passed for that. There was a kind of hush within me, the kind one might feel at the end of a performance, when the final line has been spoken, and the audience waits in that breathless dark between fiction and applause. Only this time, there would be no applause. Only ritual. I was moved, not dragged. The hands that took me were steady, familiar. One brushed my shoulder gently, almost with sympathy. Another straightened my collar. I was guided to the slab, not thrown. Placed, and for a moment,
I felt not threatened, but understood. I was not being punished. I was being added. The voices began in unison, low, measured, in rhythm, not chaotic, not frenzied. They chanted in a tongue I still could not comprehend, though part of me recognized it, not from study, but from marrow. The sound pressed against my ribs, slid beneath my skin, curled around my heart, like breath returned from the deep. The vicar's voice rose above the others. He stood beside me, not over me. And when he spoke this time, he spoke in English. Each time we remember, he said, we risk the return. But when we sacrifice memory, when we give it form, we bind it. He touched the recorder once, lightly, and said, you'll be remembered. That is enough. Then, something warm touched my brow. Not a knife, a thumb. And then, the chant quickened. The recorder whined. And I spoke. Not words. A sound I did not recognize as mine. It was pulled from me, and offered. The final segment of the audio, recovered days later from beneath a collapsed entrance at the north base of the tree, is brief. 4 minutes. The first breath, slow, shallow, cloth shifting, the sound of rope being adjusted, not tightened, not restraint, ceremony. Then voices, clearer now, chanting, not menacing, not frenzied, rehearsed, names spoken, one of them, mine, not shouted, acknowledged. Then a phrase, repeated 4 times, he remembers, so we do not. After that, wind, but not from outside, from below, as if something within the earth had exhaled. Then my voice, not frightened, not confused, flat. I say one word, Marple, then nothing, then the sound, a single note, not musical, not mechanical, a tone, low, harmonic, rooted. It rises, and with it, the screams, not of pain, not all at once. Some are mine, some are not. They twist, they blur, they become chant. The audio ends abruptly, not with silence, but with a hum that fades into static, and then cuts. No timestamp, no signature, no more.
Chapter 14. St. Mary Mead is peaceful. Again, St. Mary Mead had always known how to move on. Not by erasing the past, not by denying it, but by allowing it to settle, beneath hedgerows, behind lace curtains, between polite nods at the post office. The village was peaceful, the gardens were trimmed, the butcher had reopened, school resumed. Even the air seemed lighter, as though whatever tension had once curled around the lanes and chimneys had finally slipped free into the wind. To the untrained eye, everything had returned to normal, but nothing had returned, and nothing was normal. A new gardener arrived that week. He came from another parish, or so it was said. No one asked precisely which. He wore the same green coat, the same tan gloves, moved the same way, slow, methodical, careful with his steps. His voice, when heard at all, was low and even. The resemblance to the one who had vanished months prior was not striking. It was uncanny, yet no one spoke of it. Not directly. He introduced himself only once. "Call me Arthur," he said. No one questioned the name, not even Miss Marple, especially not Miss Marple. She now hosted community teas on Thursdays, always punctual, always smiling. Her laughter came more easily than before, perhaps a touch too easily. She poured without hesitation, complimented jam, laughed at jokes she might once have corrected for logic. But she no longer walked the green alone. She no longer sat near the oak, and when asked about the old gardener, or the journalist, or even the strange gatherings from that summer, she tilted her head slightly and replied, "Oh, you must be thinking of somewhere else," as if the memory itself were impolite, as if it belonged to another story. And yet the oak remained, taller than before, the roots wider, the bark darker, thicker in texture, as though it had begun to absorb more than rain. And then, the girl. It was meant to be an ordinary school outing, 22 children, 3 teachers, a history lesson on village law. They stopped by the tree, of course. They always did. And when they counted the children again before returning to the classroom, one was missing, Catherine Jessup. No one saw her leave. No one heard her scream. And at the base of the tree, just beneath a curtain of ivy, lay a red ribbon, folded, pressed into the dirt. As though the roots had tucked it there gently. The ribbon was not remarked upon publicly. It was not entered into the headmistress's report. It was not mentioned in the parish announcements, nor pinned to the board beside lost gloves and found kittens. It was, however, taken, quietly, by someone who would never admit to holding it. That evening, the school children were dismissed an hour early. The following morning, the vicar gave a short reading on the theme of renewal. The message, though wrapped in scripture, was clear. Things were to continue, and so they did. The children, carefully watched, were allowed to play near, but never on the green. The baker returned to his usual hours. The grocer removed the final article, referencing the journalist from the news rack. Even his name, Brent Oliver, no longer drew recognition from anyone you asked, except, of course, from Miss Marple. When approached by a passing inspector, new to the district, earnest and unsuspicious, she offered him tea, scones, and only this. I do believe someone of that name once visited, but I'm sure it was years ago, or perhaps in one of those other villages. You know how they blur together after a while. She smiled, poured another cup, and gently changed the subject to marigolds. There were no more questions, not asked, not answered. The oak, meanwhile, stood taller still, its shadow stretching slightly farther across the grass each morning, though the sun had not changed its course. Children no longer dared sit near it. Teachers directed lessons away from its roots, and yet no one spoke against it. It had become part of the village again, or perhaps it always had been. There were murmurs, of course, quiet ones, a glint of suspicion in the eyes of old Mrs. Dowling, who watched the green from her attic. A question left unasked by Mr. Tilling, who had once drawn the curtain at precisely 5 each evening, and now waited until 6. But they did not speak. They only nodded, because some truths belong to the roots, and in St. Mary Mead, that truth had never been forgotten. Only buried. There is a kind of stillness that does not reassure. It does not comfort. It settles like a fog just beyond perception, too gentle to fear, too constant to question. That was the stillness now draped over St. Mary Mead. The trees bloomed in season. The roses along the chapel wall opened in predictable measure, and yet everything was slightly quieter, as though the village had taken a long inward breath and was simply holding it. Miss Marple, who once filled her diary with observation and deduction, now filled the sugar bowl without comment. Her hands no longer trembled when they passed the window facing the green. In fact, they paused there slightly longer than necessary, as if to check, not for safety, for readiness. She led the teas each Thursday now, with more cheer than ever before. She laughed often, too often, sometimes even before the jokes had been told. And once, when asked whether she'd heard any of the nonsense about old rituals returning, she had smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, well, if it was nonsense, it wouldn't still be with us, would it? The new gardener, Arthur, could often be seen trimming hedges that did not need trimming. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always in answer to a question that had not been asked aloud. Roots are strong, he said once to a passing schoolboy, who had merely been staring. They don't forget where they've been. And he walked on. That same afternoon, a small gathering took place behind the post office. 6 villagers, none remarkable, stood in quiet conversation. They did not speak of the missing girl. They did not mention the oak. They spoke of rainfall, of jam, of footpaths recently repaved. But each of them, when they parted ways, walked once around the tree, clockwise, without touching it. That evening, Miss Marple's tea group adjourned with more laughter than usual, and she lingered at the doorway long after the guests had gone. She looked out across the green, and for just a moment, she stopped smiling. The next morning was clear. Children gathered on the school steps, their voices rising in the untamed chaos of joy.
of ordinary life untouched by yesterday. Teachers herded them gently toward the green, for what had been marked on the term schedule as local heritage walk and picnic. They brought sketchbooks, cameras, sandwiches packed with care. Each child was assigned a buddy. Catherine Jessup had been missing for 8 days. Her name was no longer spoken aloud. When the children arrived near the tree, the head teacher paused, then nodded, habit over hesitation, and led them past the wooden post that marked a boundary. A dozen eyes turned upward toward the oak, which now towered just slightly higher than any photograph of it showed. No branches had been added, but something in its posture had changed. It stood not as witness, but as monument. The children scattered in pairs. They drew roots. They traced bark. And then as the sun dipped behind the chapel spire, the teacher clapped once and counted. 21. Not 22. Again. 21. No cries, no screams, just one girl missing. No one remembered seeing her leave. No one saw her cross the field. And there, where she had last been standing, nestled between 2 stones, a single braid of hair, tied with a red ribbon, as though it had been placed there deliberately. Not in warning, not in threat, but in greeting. And the oak, older now than it had ever been, cast its shadow a little wider across the grass, just enough to touch the child nearest to it. And Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the green beside the vicar, smiled gently, but said nothing.
Chapter 15. Beneath the bark. It began, as endings so often do, with something lost returning. Not with thunder, not with triumph, but with the gentlest of disturbances. A drawer left ajar that had not been touched. A mark on the floor where none had walked. A journal, once burned, no longer. Ash. Miss Marple's handwriting was unmistakable, precise, unhurried. Every line disciplined by years of truth, handled like porcelain. And yet, this final journal, hidden behind a loose panel in the rectory loft, discovered only when a new caretaker had gone to silence an unexplained creak, was different. The pages bore pressure, as though the words themselves had been written while pressing down something far heavier than a pen. The first page bore no date, only a title, For the One Who Will Be Next. The entries began after her return, though no time was marked. Only seasons, only moods. The tree is no longer waiting. It is remembering. Another page. They ask nothing of me, and that is the most terrifying request of all. And then, deeper still, this: I did not come back. I was sent back, not as witness, as messenger. The final entry was short, barely 6 lines. The oak was never evil. It never chose. It only stood. We made it hunger. We fed it. We still do. There was no signature, only a fingerprint in dust along the bottom corner of the page. And behind that journal, tucked flat against the inside wall, a photograph, not printed, not modern, developed on paper, yellowed by time. It showed the tree, in full bloom, bark smooth, and there, barely visible, in the shadows along its side, a face, or the memory of one, not drawn, not imagined, pressed, like a fossil. Miss Marple, eyes closed, mouth, not in fear, in patience. The journal, though clearly meant to remain hidden, was written not for secrecy, but for selection. Its tone shifted subtly as the pages progressed. What began as observation grew into resignation, and finally into something colder. Not surrender, not remorse, something close to permission. One line, scribbled hastily in the margin beside the final entry, read, "It was never what we were keeping out. It was what we left behind." And then, in a hand tighter than the rest, as though the author had paused before writing it, there was one more name, but the line beneath was torn. Not cut, torn, as if whatever name had been written had been removed, not by mistake, but by necessity, or perhaps protection. The photograph was left intact, its surface smooth, too smooth. No fingerprint oils, no dust, as though someone had returned to clean it recently. And the face in the bark, indistinct yet inarguable,
wore a strange expression, one that could not quite be interpreted as peace. And yet it wasn't fear. It was pause. A look held just before a decision. Outside, the tree stood in the same place it always had. But from the loft's narrow window, something appeared subtly different. The angle of a root, the pitch of a branch, a shape that hadn't been visible before. A darkened hollow near its base, perfectly round, as if something had once been placed there, or taken down in the village. The green remained undisturbed. Children played further away now. The vicar smiled more often. The gardener, still Arthur, always Arthur, trimmed hedges that had already been shaped. And Miss Marple, she had not been seen in days. Not in the garden, not at the tea, but her voice remained. Some said it was only in the wind. Others swore they'd heard her in the stillness, just before the clock struck the hour, saying something soft, too soft to repeat. And others still did not speak of her at all, because the forgetting had begun again, not erasure, absorption, like rain through roots. On the third day, just before dusk, a wide shot was captured by a passing tourist's drone, meant only to document the changing colours of autumn in the English countryside. It hovered no more than 20 seconds above St. Mary Mead, before turning back toward the hills. But in that short moment, as it swept across the green and steadied above the oak, something became clear. The tree was not alone. The branches, tall and twisting in their usual silent posture, cast shadows that fell across the ground like fingers, unmoving. But in the bark, just above the hollow near the base, a trick of light exposed texture where there should have been none. Faces, not detailed, not photographic, just the impressions, pressed in layers, 4, perhaps 5, though some swore there were more. They were not frightened, not pleading. They were watching. One looked like a child, another, older, spectacled, brow furrowed. One bore a faint scar across the lip, and another wore a slight, knowing smile. Miss Marple, still, waiting, not for help, for continuity. That night, the church bells rang out once, though no service had been scheduled. No one admitted to pulling the rope. No one claimed to have heard them, except one. Catherine Jessop's younger sister, who stood at the window and said very quietly, "She's not gone." The mother asked who. The child only pointed to the tree, and said she watches now. At midnight, the final page of the journal, recovered, restored and sealed by someone unnamed, was quietly deposited in the village archives, not displayed, not hidden. Tucked behind a children's book on wildflowers. Its message: some truths belong to the roots, others grow from them. Then nothing, until the recording played. The recording was short, only 7 seconds. Discovered not in the archives, nor on tape, nor buried among papers, but embedded in the memory of the very drone that had passed above the village just days earlier. The audio, recovered by a technician reviewing footage for unrelated reasons, was not part of the official file. It began in static, then came the wind, then a voice, clear, precise, unmistakable. Miss Marple, calm, deliberate. "The oak was never evil," she said. "It's what we buried that made it hunger." Then silence, and after 3 seconds, a final phrase, not whispered, not hidden, spoken plainly, "And it's not done yet." Then the wind returned. But it was not the sound of something leaving, it was something arriving, and the bark, etched with faces, framed by root and hollow, shifted ever so slightly in the fading light, as though listening, or remembering, or choosing, because stories like roots do not end. They deepen, they twist, they wait, and the oak is waiting. If you've stayed with us through every chapter, thank you. These mysteries are far from over. Consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. It's the best way to stay with us through every shadow and every revelation.